The banker's ultimatum came on the hottest day of summer. Marry the town's most scorned woman by sunset or lose everything. Caleb Hartley stood in that airless office, sweat running down his spine, staring at papers that would either make Eleanor Brooks his wife or make him homeless. She wasn't his choice, she was his sentence. And in 6 hours, they'd stand before a preacher who'd bind two strangers with vows neither wanted, sealing a marriage born of coercion, humiliation, and the cruel mathematics of survival. Some unions begin with love. This one began with a threat. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what starts as a forced marriage becomes something neither of them could have imagined. The heat that summer pressed down on Silver Ridge County like a hand determined to suffocate. It turned the grass brittle, dried the creek beds to exposed bone, and made temper short even among patient men. Caleb Hartley felt it burning through his shirt as he stood on the porch of his failing ranch, watching dust devils spin across land that no longer felt like his own. 3 years of bad luck had brought him here. First the drought, then the cattle disease that swept through the valley, taking half his herd in a single season. Then his wife Sarah's sudden fever, the one that killed her in 4 days despite everything the doctor tried. And finally, the debt, mountains of it, accumulated through medical bills, failed crops, and the desperate loans he'd taken to keep food on the table for his daughter Lucy. The ranch that had been in his family for 2 generations now belonged, on paper at least, to Harold Pemberton, the Silver Ridge Bank president, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose generosity came with interest rates that multiplied like weeds. Caleb had known the reckoning was coming. He just hadn't expected it to arrive with a wedding dress. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Pemberton's clerk, a nervous young man who wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes as he handed over the envelope. The message inside was brief and devastating. Present yourself at my office by noon. The matter is urgent and concerns the immediate future of your property. Caleb left Lucy with their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a widow who'd shown them kindness even when others in town had started to whisper about the Hartley curse. The girl was 8 years old, thin as a rail, with her mother's dark hair and his own stubborn jaw. She'd grown quiet since Sarah died, speaking only when necessary, as if words themselves had become too expensive to waste. "I'll be back before supper," Caleb told her, though the knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. "Are we losing the ranch?" Lucy asked, her voice small but steady. He knelt before her, placing both hands on her narrow shoulders. "Not if I can help it." But as he rode into town, the weight of that promise felt heavier than the sun beating down on his shoulders. Silver Ridge's main street was quiet in the midday heat. Most sensible people were inside, shuttering windows against the glare. The bank stood at the corner of Main and Church, a 2-story brick building that Pemberton had renovated the previous year with money he'd made from men exactly like Caleb, men who'd borrowed hope and found themselves drowning in obligation. The clerk escorted Caleb upstairs to Pemberton's private office, a room decorated with dark wood furniture and landscape paintings that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Pemberton himself sat behind an enormous desk, his gray suit immaculate despite the heat, his silver hair pomaded to perfection. "Mr. Hartley," he said without rising. "Punctual as always, please, sit." Caleb remained standing. "Let's get to it. What's this about?" Pemberton steepled his fingers, his expression one of practiced concern. "Your loan, naturally, the one that came due 3 months ago. The one you've been unable to repay despite my considerable patience." "I've been paying what I can—" "What you can," Pemberton interrupted, "amounts to prolonging the inevitable. Your ranch is worth perhaps $2,000 in its current condition. You owe me nearly $3,000, with interest accumulating daily. The mathematics are quite clear." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I need more time. Another season. The cattle prices will not recover quickly enough to save you," Pemberton said flatly. "However," he paused, letting the word hang in the air like bait, "I'm prepared to offer you an alternative." Something in the banker's tone made Caleb's skin crawl. "What alternative?" Pemberton opened a drawer and withdrew a folder, laying it on the desk between them. "There's a woman in this town, Eleanor Brooks. You know of her? Caleb frowned. The school teacher? Former school teacher, Pemberton corrected. The board dismissed her last spring. Too opinionated, they said. Too challenging of established authority. She's been living on charity since then, taking in mending work, whatever scraps the town will throw her way. He opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be legal documents. Miss Brooks is 32 years old, unmarried, and according to local sentiment, likely to remain so. The town regards her as a lost cause, a woman past her prime who squandered her youth on books instead of finding a husband. What's this got to do with me? Pemberton's smile was thin and calculated. Miss Brooks came to me 2 months ago, requesting a loan to open a small school of her own. She has saved some money, enough for a modest start, but not enough to purchase property or secure the necessary supplies. She needs financial backing. So give her the loan, Caleb said, though he was beginning to see where this was heading. I would, except she has no collateral. No property, no family wealth, no husband to co-sign. The risk is simply too great. Pemberton leaned forward. Unless, of course, she were to acquire such a husband. A man with land, even mortgaged land. A man who understands the value of practical arrangements over romantic notions. The office suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. You want me to marry her? I want to solve 2 problems simultaneously, Pemberton said smoothly. Miss Brooks needs security and the social standing that marriage provides. You need your debt forgiven. Marry her, and I'll tear up your loan papers. The ranch becomes yours again, free and clear. Miss Brooks gets the respectability she needs to reestablish herself, and eventually access to resources for her school. That's insane, Caleb said, his voice rough. You can't force people into marriage like livestock at auction. I'm not forcing anyone, Pemberton replied, his tone maddeningly calm. I'm offering a business solution. You're free to refuse, of course. I'll simply proceed with foreclosure. You'll lose the ranch, and your daughter will lose the only home she's ever known. Miss Brooks will continue her decline into poverty and irrelevance. Everyone loses. He tapped the folder. Or you can both gain something valuable. The choice is yours. She'd never agree to this, Caleb said, grasping for any argument. No woman would accept such a thing. Miss Brooks is practical above all else, Pemberton said. She understands that her prospects in this town are effectively finished. Marriage, even an unconventional one, restores her social position and provides material security. I've already discussed the broad strokes with her. She's waiting downstairs. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. She's here? Now? I thought it prudent for you both to understand the terms simultaneously. Pemberton stood, smoothing his jacket. You have until 5 o'clock to decide. If you agree, the ceremony will take place at 6 at Judge Morrison's home. I've already made the arrangements. If you refuse, foreclosure papers will be filed tomorrow morning. He moved toward the door. I'll give you a moment to think. Miss Brooks is in the waiting room. Perhaps you'd like to meet your potential bride. He left before Caleb could respond, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. Caleb stood frozen, his mind racing through impossible calculations. $3,000. The ranch. Lucy's future. And now this woman, this stranger, being offered as some kind of solution to a problem she hadn't created. He could walk out, refuse the whole grotesque arrangement. They'd lose everything, but at least they'd keep their dignity. He could take Lucy, find work somewhere else, start over. Except starting over meant abandoning his father's legacy. It meant Lucy growing up without roots, without the land that had been promised to her since birth. It meant admitting defeat to men like Pemberton, who treated people's lives like numbers in a ledger. The door opened again. Caleb turned, expecting Pemberton's return. Instead, he saw her. Eleanor Brooks was not what he expected. The town's gossip had painted her as severe and unapproachable, a spinster schoolmarm with a tongue like vinegar. The woman who stood in the doorway was slender and straight-backed, wearing a simple gray dress that had been mended multiple times at the cuffs. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her face, while not conventionally beautiful, held an intelligence in the eyes that made him immediately cautious. She wasn't looking at him with hope or desperation. She was studying him the way a general might study a map before battle, calculating, assessing, preparing for what came next. Mr. Hartley, she said, her voice clear and unshaken, I assume Mr. Pemberton has explained his proposal. His blackmail, you mean, Caleb said roughly. Something flickered in her expression. Not offense, but acknowledgement. Call it what you like. The terms remain the same. She moved into the room uninvited, taking the chair Pemberton had offered earlier. Her posture was perfect, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Everything about her suggested control, but Caleb noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles were white where her fingers gripped each other. You can't possibly want this, he said. Want? Eleanor's laugh was short and bitter. Mr. Hartley, I stopped having the luxury of want 2 years ago when the school board decided that a woman who teaches girls mathematics and history is dangerous to community morals. I've been surviving on mending work and charity since then, watching my savings disappear coin by coin while this town whispers about me in shop doorways. She met his eyes directly. I don't want this marriage, but I need it, just as you do. Her honesty was more unsettling than lies would have been. There has to be another way. If you found one, I'd be grateful to hear it, she said. I've spent 2 years looking. Every door that might have opened for me has been closed by reputation. I'm too old, too opinionated, too educated. I'm a cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters about the dangers of choosing books over babies. She stood, moving to the window that overlooked Main Street. This marriage solves both our problems. You keep your ranch, I regain social standing and eventually the resources to open my school. It's practical. It's hell, Caleb said, tying 2 strangers together for the rest of their lives because a banker decided to play God. Eleanor turned from the window, and for the first time he saw something vulnerable beneath her composed exterior. Do you have a better suggestion? Because if you do, please share it. I'm tired, Mr. Hartley. I'm tired of being afraid every time I pay my rent that it might be the last time. Tired of seeing pity in people's eyes when they pass me on the street. Tired of knowing that my education, everything I worked for, means nothing in the face of being unmarried at 32. The silence between them stretched. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street below. What about love? Caleb finally asked, and immediately felt foolish for saying it. Eleanor's smile was sad. I buried love with my illusions about what this world offers women like me. I'm not asking for romance, Mr. Hartley. I'm asking for survival. Dignified survival, if possible, but survival nonetheless. She moved back toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. Pemberton said you have a daughter. Lucy, isn't it? The sound of his daughter's name in this stranger's mouth made Caleb's chest tighten. Leave her out of this. She's the reason you're considering it at all, Eleanor said quietly, because losing the ranch means losing her home, her security. Children need stability, especially after loss. I understand that, even if I've never been a mother. She paused. I won't try to replace your wife. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. But I'll honor whatever boundaries you set, and I'll help maintain your household as fairly as I know how. That's all I can offer. She left then, her footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the stairs. Caleb stood alone in Pemberton's office, staring at the folder on the desk. Inside were his debts, itemized and damning. Also inside, apparently, was his future, or what passed for a future when you were drowning and someone threw you an anchor instead of a rope. He thought of Lucy's face that morning, the fear she tried to hide behind a brave front. He thought of his father, who'd built the ranch from nothing and left it to Caleb with the simple instruction to keep it in the family. He thought of Sarah, buried in the plot behind the church, and wondered what she'd think of this impossible choice. Then he thought of Eleanor Brooks' white knuckles, the exhaustion in her eyes despite her straight spine, and the way she'd called their situation by its true name, survival. At 4:30, he found Pemberton in his ground floor office, going through papers as if this were any other Tuesday afternoon. I'll do it, Caleb said, but I want the loan papers destroyed in front of me, immediately after the ceremony. Pemberton looked up, his expression pleased but unsurprised. Of course, Judge Morrison will serve as witness. 6 o'clock, Mr. Hartley. Don't be late. The ceremony was as cold as the marriage itself. Judge Morrison's parlor was small and stifling, despite the windows being open to catch any hint of evening breeze. The judge himself was in his 60s, a practical man who'd overseen countless weddings, and probably found this one only slightly more unusual than most. Eleanor arrived precisely at 6, wearing the same gray dress. Caleb had gone home to tell Lucy, a conversation that had gone worse than he'd feared. "You're marrying someone else?" Lucy had asked, her voice small and shocked. "Already?" "It's not like that," Caleb had tried to explain. It's for the ranch, so we don't lose our home." "Mama's barely been gone 3 years," Lucy said, and the accusation in her young voice cut deeper than any blade. He'd had no good answer for that. Still didn't. Standing in Judge Morrison's parlor while Pemberton looked on with satisfaction barely concealed. Eleanor stood across from him, her face composed and unreadable. When the judge began the standard vows, her voice was steady and clear. Caleb's own responses felt like they came from someone else's mouth, words spoken in a dream where nothing made sense, but you kept moving forward anyway. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Morrison said, closing his book. "You may kiss the bride." Eleanor's eyes met Caleb's briefly. By mutual, unspoken agreement, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against her forehead, a gesture more brotherly than romantic, appropriate for what they both knew this was. Pemberton produced the loan documents with a flourish, setting them on the judge's desk. He struck a match, held it to the corner of the papers, and they all watched as $3,000 of debt turned to ash in a metal bowl. "Congratulations," Pemberton said, as if he'd done them both a tremendous favor. "I'll have the deed transfer completed by week's end. Your property is your own again, Mr. Hartley. And Mrs. Hartley," he turned to Eleanor with a smile that made Caleb's skin crawl. "You're now a respectable married woman. I trust this arrangement will prove beneficial to all parties." Eleanor said nothing. Her face was a mask. "I've arranged for your belongings to be delivered to the ranch tomorrow," Pemberton continued. "I thought it best to expedite the transition." "How generous," Eleanor said, her tone perfectly neutral and somehow devastating in its lack of emotion. They left together, this new husband and wife walking out into the early evening heat. A few townspeople saw them exit Morrison's house, saw Eleanor's hand not quite touching Caleb's arm, saw the stiffness in both their postures. By morning, the whole town would know. Caleb had brought the wagon. Eleanor climbed up to the seat without assistance, arranging her skirts with methodical precision. The silence between them as they rode out of town was absolute. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. A house, a barn, corrals, and the endless expanse of struggling grassland beyond. It had never looked more desolate to Caleb than it did in that moment, knowing he was bringing home a wife who wasn't wanted and didn't want to be there. "It's not much," he said as they approached. The first word spoken since leaving town. "I've seen worse," Eleanor replied. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen with Lucy when they entered. The widow took one look at Eleanor, then at Caleb, and understanding flooded her features. She said something quiet in Cantonese, probably a prayer, though Caleb couldn't be sure, and reached for her shawl. "Lucy is fed," she said to Caleb. "I'll leave you to your evening." She nodded to Eleanor. "Ma'am." "Thank you for your kindness," Eleanor said, and Mrs. Chen paused, something in her expression softening. "It's harder than it needs to be," the widow said softly, "but it gets more possible with time." Then she was gone, closing the door gently behind her. Lucy stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at Eleanor with unconcealed hostility. At 8 years old, she was already skilled at communicating betrayal without words. "Lucy," Caleb said carefully, "this is Miss Brooks. Mrs. Hartley now. She's going to be staying here." "I know who she is," Lucy said. "Everyone knows. The teacher who got fired, the old maid nobody wanted." "Lucy, it's all right," Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm. "She's angry. She has reason to be." She addressed Lucy directly. "You're right about me. I am those things. The town does think of me that way, and you're also right to be upset about this situation. It's sudden and strange, and nobody asked what you wanted." She paused. "I'm not here to replace your mother. I couldn't if I tried, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I am here, and we need to find a way to live in the same house without making each other miserable. I'm willing to try if you are." Lucy's expression didn't soften. My mama was beautiful and kind, and everyone loved her. You're none of those things. Lucy! Caleb's voice came out harsher than he intended. Eleanor raised a hand slightly, stopping him. No, let her speak. She's entitled to her feelings. I don't want you here, Lucy said, her voice breaking. I don't want any of this. Neither do I, Eleanor said quietly, but here we are, so we'll have to make the best of it. Lucy turned and ran, her footsteps pounding up the stairs to her room. The slam of her door echoed through the house. Caleb felt exhaustion settle over him like a physical weight. I'm sorry, she's not usually cruel, she's just grieving, Eleanor finished, and now forced to accept a stranger in her home. I understand. She doesn't need to like me. She just needs to tolerate my presence. She looked around the kitchen, taking in the unwashed dishes, the dust in the corners, the general air of neglect that came from a house where nobody had the energy for anything beyond survival. Where would you like me to sleep? The question was practical and devastating in its implications. There's a spare room, Caleb said. Used to be my father's study. I'll put a bed in there. For now, you can have my room. I'll sleep in the barn. That's unnecessary. It's necessary for me, Caleb said firmly. I won't have you sleeping in the barn like hired help. This is supposed to be your home now, even if neither of us chose it. He moved toward the stairs. I'll get you some blankets. There might be a nightdress in the trunk upstairs, something of Sarah's. He stopped, realizing what he'd said. Eleanor's expression didn't change. That would be practical. Thank you. He fled upstairs, grateful for the excuse to escape her steady gaze. In the room he'd shared with Sarah, he found the trunk at the foot of the bed, filled with clothes he hadn't been able to give away yet. He pulled out a simple cotton nightdress, trying not to remember Sarah wearing it, trying not to feel like a traitor to her memory. When he returned downstairs, Eleanor was already working, clearing the dishes from the table, pumping water to heat on the stove. She'd removed her jacket and rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms marked with old burn scars and the strong muscles of someone used to physical work. You don't have to, he started. Yes, I do, she said without turning. This is my household now, too. I might as well understand what needs doing. She glanced back at him. Besides, idle hands make for difficult thoughts. I'd rather stay busy. Caleb set the nightdress on a clean corner of the table. There's soap in the washroom, towels in the cupboard by the door. Help yourself to anything you need. Thank you. Eleanor turned back to the dishes, her movements efficient and practiced. Mr. Hartley, Caleb, I think we should establish some rules. Boundaries, for both our sakes. All right, he said warily. I'll manage the household duties, cooking, cleaning, mending. I'll be civil to your daughter even when she's not civil to me. I'll attend church with you if required, though I suspect my presence will cause talk. She paused, her hand still in the dishwater. In exchange, I need my own space, the ability to pursue my own work, my reading, my correspondence, eventually my school if circumstances allow. And I need you to understand that while this is a legal marriage, it's not a real one. Separate rooms, separate lives where it matters. I never expected anything different, Caleb said quietly. Eleanor nodded, still not looking at him. Good. Then we understand each other. She pulled her hands from the water, drying them on a towel. I'll finish here, then retire. You don't need to sleep in the barn. I'm sure we can both manage sharing a house like civilized adults. But Caleb shook his head. First night at least. Let Lucy adjust to the idea before I'm sleeping under the same roof as someone who isn't her mother. It'll be easier for her. Understanding flickered in Eleanor's eyes. You're a better father than you give yourself credit for. I'm a desperate father, Caleb corrected. There's a difference. He left her in the kitchen and went out to the barn carrying blankets and the weight of what he'd done. The livestock, what remained of his diminished herd, stirred as he entered, the familiar smell of hay and animal musk oddly comforting after the strangeness of the day. He made a bed in the empty stall where they'd once kept Sarah's riding horse, before they'd had to sell it to pay medical bills. Through the barn's open door he could see the house, lit now by lamplight in the kitchen where his new wife cleaned up the debris of their lives. Married to a stranger, because Harold Pemberton had decided to play puppet master with desperate people's futures. Caleb lay back on the thin mattress of hay and blankets, staring up at the barn's rafters. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to make this work, how to run a ranch with a woman who knew nothing about cattle, how to help Lucy accept this impossible change, how to live with someone he'd been forced to bind himself to legally and permanently. Tomorrow. Tonight, he just let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just Sarah, though her absence still ached like a phantom limb, but his freedom, his dignity, his right to choose his own path forward. He'd traded all of it for land and the hope that his daughter wouldn't lose the only home she'd ever known. In the darkness, he couldn't tell if it had been worth it. Inside the house, Eleanor Brooks, Eleanor Hartley now, though the name felt like clothing that didn't fit, finished the dishes and stood alone in the kitchen of a house that wasn't hers, married to a man who was essentially a stranger, resented by a child who had every right to hate her presence. This was survival. This was dignity. This was the best she could hope for in a world that had decided she had no value beyond what marriage could provide. She picked up the nightdress Caleb had left on the table, went upstairs to the room that had belonged to a dead woman, and closed the door on the first day of her forced new life. Neither of them slept well that night, but morning would come anyway, bringing with it the next impossible day, and the next, and all the days after, bound together by paper and desperation, learning to survive in a marriage neither had chosen, and both were trapped within. The forced vow had been spoken. Now came the infinitely harder part, living with its consequences. The morning came too early and too bright. Sunlight streaming through gaps in the barn walls, where Caleb had spent a restless night counting the hours until dawn made escape possible. His back ached from the makeshift bed, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight sitting on his chest, the knowledge that he'd have to walk into that house and face what he'd done. He tended the animals first, delaying the inevitable. The few remaining cattle needed checking, the chickens required feeding, and the horse that pulled their wagon deserved attention he'd been neglecting. Physical work had always been his refuge, the place where thoughts could be set aside in favor of simple, honest labor. But this morning, even mucking stalls couldn't quiet the voice in his head asking what kind of man sold himself into marriage to keep his land. The kind who had a daughter to protect, he answered himself. The kind who'd run out of choices. When he finally approached the house, smoke was already rising from the chimney. Someone had started a fire in the stove, which meant Eleanor was awake and already working. The thought made him oddly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to anyone else managing the household rhythms he and Lucy had fallen into after Sarah's death. He entered through the kitchen door, boots deliberately heavy on the porch boards to announce his presence. The room smelled different: coffee, bacon, something baking that might have been biscuits. Eleanor stood at the stove with her back to him, her hair pulled into the same practical knot as yesterday, wearing a different dress but one just as plain and carefully mended. "There's coffee," she said without turning. "Cups are in the cupboard by the window." Caleb poured himself a cup, the silence between them stretching thin. "You didn't have to cook." "We both need to eat," Eleanor replied, flipping bacon with practiced efficiency. "And I told you I'd manage household duties. Might as well start as I mean to continue." She glanced back at him briefly. "Lucy hasn't come down yet. I heard her moving around upstairs about 20 minutes ago, but she hasn't appeared." "She's avoiding us," Caleb said. "Can't blame her." "No," Eleanor agreed quietly. "We can't." The bacon finished, Eleanor transferred it to a plate and began pulling biscuits from the oven. They were golden and properly risen, nothing like the flat, heavy things Caleb had been making for the past 3 years. She set the food on the table with the same methodical precision she'd shown in everything else. No wasted movement, no unnecessary flourish. "You should call her," Eleanor said. "She needs to eat, even if she's angry." Caleb moved to the base of the stairs. "Lucy, breakfast." No response. He started up the stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and knocked on her bedroom door. "Lucy, come eat. Now." "Not hungry," came the muffled reply. "Wasn't a request," Caleb said, injecting firmness into his voice. "Kitchen, 5 minutes." He returned downstairs to find Eleanor had set 3 places at the table, perfectly spaced, each with a plate and utensils arranged just so. She'd taken the seat farthest from the head of the table, claiming neither the position of wife nor guest, just somewhere in between. Lucy appeared in the doorway, her face set in stubborn lines, her eyes red-rimmed from crying she wouldn't admit to. She looked at the food, at Eleanor, then at her father. I said I wasn't hungry. And I said, sit down, Caleb replied. We don't waste food in this house, and Mrs. Hartley went to the trouble of cooking. You'll eat something. Lucy's jaw tightened, but she moved to her usual chair, the one closest to where Sarah used to sit. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. She took a biscuit, broke it apart, but didn't eat. Eleanor served herself small portions, her movements quiet. The silence in the kitchen felt dense enough to cut. These are good biscuits, Caleb offered, trying to ease the tension. My mother taught me, Eleanor said. She believed a woman should know how to make the most of limited resources. Where's she now? The question came from Lucy, surprising them both. Eleanor set down her fork carefully. Dead. 10 years ago. Consumption. And your father? Lucy's tone was challenging, looking for weakness. Also dead. Before my mother. Accident at the mill where he worked. Eleanor met Lucy's gaze steadily. I was 22, alone with no family and about $30 to my name. That's when I became a teacher. But they fired you, Lucy said. Lucy, Caleb warned. Let her speak, Eleanor said calmly. Yes, they fired me. The school board decided that teaching girls advanced mathematics and encouraging them to question assumptions was inappropriate. They wanted someone who would focus on penmanship and domestic arts instead. Why didn't you just do what they wanted? Lucy asked, and beneath the hostility was genuine confusion. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Because I remember being young and being told my mind was less important than my appearance. Being told that curiosity in a girl was unseemly. Being told to make myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. She paused. I couldn't in good conscience teach other girls those same lies. So yes, they fired me, and yes, it cost me dearly. But some things are worth the cost. Even if it means nobody wants you? Lucy's words were meant to wound. Especially then, Eleanor said quietly, because wanting to be wanted and needing to respect yourself are different things. I chose the latter. Lucy's expression flickered, not quite softening, but something shifting behind her eyes. She took a small bite of biscuit, chewed slowly, then another bite. They finished the meal in silence, but it felt less hostile than before. Marginally. After breakfast, Eleanor began clearing dishes while Caleb prepared to head out to check the north fence line. Lucy disappeared upstairs again, and the house settled into uneasy quiet. I'll need to go into town later, Eleanor said as Caleb reached for his hat. My belongings should have arrived at the general store. Pemberton said he'd have them delivered there. Caleb nodded. I'll hitch the wagon after I'm done with the fences. Should be back by noon. Thank you. Eleanor paused in her washing. Caleb, last night you asked about love. I've been thinking about that. He waited, hand on the doorframe. I don't expect it, she continued, and I won't pretend to feel what I don't. But I think we could manage something like respect, maybe even partnership of a sort, if we're both honest about what this is. Two people trying to survive in a world that's not kind to those who fall outside its expectations. She turned to face him. That might not be love, but it's not nothing either. No, Caleb agreed. It's not nothing. He left before the conversation could go deeper, escaping into the clear morning where the problems were straightforward, broken fences, wandering cattle, work that had definable solutions. The north fence was worse than he'd thought, 3 posts rotted through and a section of wire sagging dangerously. He lost himself in the work of digging new post holes, setting fresh timber, stretching wire taut and true. His hands knew this labor intimately, the rhythm of it older than thought. He was hammering the final staple when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Thomas Whitmore, his nearest neighbor, rode up on a bay gelding, his weathered face creased with something between concern and curiosity. Morning, Caleb, Thomas said, dismounting. Heard some news in town yesterday. Wanted to see if it was true. Caleb drove the staple home with one final blow. Depends on what you heard. That you married Eleanor Brooks. Judge Morrison's place, quick ceremony, Pemberton standing witness. Thomas pulled off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead. That true? It's true. Mind telling me why you'd do something like that? Woman's got a reputation. For being educated and unwilling to pretend otherwise, Caleb interrupted. Yeah, I've heard the reputation. Seems to me the town's problem, not hers. Thomas studied him carefully. This about your debt to Pemberton? There was no point lying to a man who'd known him since childhood. He offered to tear up my loan papers if I married her. She needed security and social standing. It solved both our problems. Jesus, Caleb. Thomas's voice was heavy with something like pity. You know what people are going to say. That you were so desperate you'd marry anyone. That she trapped you into it somehow. That neither of you— I don't care what people say, Caleb cut in, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. My daughter still has a home. That's what matters. And how's Lucy taking it? About as well as you'd expect. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, Martha wanted me to invite you all to dinner, Sunday after church. She thought Eleanor might need a friendly face. Town can be cruel to women they've decided to judge. The gesture surprised Caleb enough that he met his neighbor's eyes directly. Your wife would do that, knowing how people will talk? Martha's got her own thoughts about how this town treats women who don't fit their narrow expectations, Thomas said. She liked Eleanor, back when Eleanor was teaching, said she was one of the only teachers who actually taught the girls something useful instead of just preparing them to be ornaments. He settled his hat back on his head. Sunday, 4 o'clock. Tell her she's welcome. He rode off before Caleb could properly respond, leaving him standing by the fence wondering how many other assumptions he'd made about his neighbor's opinions were wrong. By the time Caleb returned to the house, it was nearly 1 o'clock. He found Lucy sitting on the porch steps, drawing patterns in the dust with a stick, her expression distant. Where's Eleanor? He asked. Inside, reading. Lucy didn't look up. She's been reading all morning, just sitting there with a book like she belongs. She does belong, Caleb said carefully. This is her home now, too. It's not, Lucy said fiercely. It's Mama's home. It'll always be Mama's home. She doesn't belong here. Caleb sat down beside his daughter, his large frame making the step creak. Lucy, your Mama's gone. I know that's hard. You replaced her, Lucy interrupted. You let them make you replace her with someone nobody even likes. I didn't replace her, Caleb said quietly. Nobody could replace your mother, but we needed help, and Eleanor needed help. And sometimes life puts people together in ways that aren't perfect, but are necessary. That's just how things are. I hate it, Lucy whispered. I know, baby, I know. They sat in silence for a while, father and daughter both mourning different versions of the same loss. Finally, Caleb stood, brushing dust from his pants. I need to take the wagon to town. Eleanor's belongings came in. You want to come along? Lucy shook her head. I'll stay here. All right. Mrs. Chen said she'd check on you if we were gone long. You'd be good for her. Inside, he found Eleanor in what had been his father's study, now apparently her claimed space. She sat in the old leather chair by the window, a book open in her lap, but her eyes were focused somewhere beyond the glass, her expression distant and unguarded. In that moment, she looked younger and more vulnerable than he'd yet seen her. She noticed him, and the vulnerability vanished, replaced by her usual composure. Ready to go? Whenever you are. She marked her place in the book, something with a worn leather cover he didn't recognize, and retrieved her shawl. They walked to the barn together, the afternoon heat pressing down like a weight. The ride into town was quiet at first, the wagon rattling over the rough road, dust rising in their wake. Caleb found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way she held herself so carefully separate despite sitting only a foot away. Thomas Whitmore came by this morning, he said finally. His wife Martha wants us to come to dinner Sunday, after church. Eleanor's surprise was subtle but visible. That's unexpected. Martha apparently thought well of you when you were teaching. Martha Whitmore has 4 daughters, Eleanor said softly. She used to tell me she was grateful someone was teaching them that their minds mattered as much as their faces. I didn't think she'd want to associate with me now. People usually don't, once you've been marked as improper. Seems she's not like most people. No, Eleanor agreed. She's not. She was quiet for a moment, then said, We should go. It would be good for Lucy to see that not everyone in town views this situation, views me, with disdain. Silver Ridge came into view, the collection of buildings shimmering slightly in the afternoon heat. As they drove down Main Street, Caleb noticed people staring, saw women lean together to whisper, saw men's expressions shift from curiosity to something harder to read. At the general store, Eleanor's belongings were waiting. 3 trunks and 2 smaller cases, everything she owned in the world packed into 5 containers. The store owner, a thin man named Peterson, barely acknowledged Eleanor as Caleb loaded the trunks into the wagon. "Heard you got married," Peterson said to Caleb, his tone carefully neutral. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Caleb replied evenly. "Sudden thing, wasn't it? Pemberton's idea, I heard." Eleanor, who'd been examining fabric samples near the window, turned slowly. "Mr. Peterson, if you have something to say about my marriage, I'd prefer you say it directly rather than dancing around the subject." Peterson flushed. "No offense meant, Mrs. Hartley." "None taken," she said coolly, "though I suspect offense was precisely what you intended." She moved toward the door. "Good day." Outside, climbing back onto the wagon, her hands were shaking slightly. Caleb pretended not to notice. They were halfway out of town when they passed Harold Pemberton on the street, his suit perfect despite the heat, his expression one of satisfied amusement as he tipped his hat to them. "How long do you think he'll hold this over us?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Forever," Caleb replied. "Men like him don't give up leverage. They just wait for the next time they can use it." "Oh, then we'll have to make sure he has no leverage to use," Eleanor said, and something in her voice made Caleb glance over. Her profile was set, determined, the vulnerability he'd glimpsed earlier completely gone. "Men like Pemberton only have power because people let them, because we're all too afraid or too desperate to push back." "Pushing back is what got you fired from teaching. And not pushing back is what got you trapped in a marriage you didn't want," Eleanor countered. "So perhaps neither of us has found the right approach yet." Back at the ranch, they unloaded Eleanor's trunks in silence, carrying them up to what was now her room. Lucy watched from the porch, her expression unreadable. That evening's dinner was marginally less tense than breakfast, though Lucy still barely spoke and Eleanor maintained her careful distance. After the dishes were washed and Lucy had gone to bed, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves alone in the kitchen again, the lamp casting long shadows across the worn table. "Thank you," Eleanor said suddenly. "For earlier, at the store, you didn't have to defend me." "Peterson was being an ass," Caleb replied. "And you're my wife. People can think what they want, but I won't have them disrespecting you to your face." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. "Is that what we are? Actually husband and wife? Or are we just 2 people performing a role to satisfy the law and social expectation?" It was a fair question, one Caleb had been avoiding thinking too hard about. "I don't know," he admitted. "What do you think?" Eleanor traced a pattern on the table's surface, her finger following the grain of the wood. "I think we're something undefined. Not strangers anymore, but not partners either. Somewhere in between, trying to figure out what's possible within the constraints we're trapped by." She looked up at him. "Does that make sense?" "More sense than most things lately," Caleb said. They separated for the night. Eleanor to her room, Caleb to the barn again, though she'd protested it was unnecessary. But he couldn't quite bring himself to sleep under the same roof yet, not while everything still felt so raw and strange. The next 3 days established a rhythm, fragile and uncertain, but functional. Eleanor managed the household with quiet efficiency, never asking permission, but also never overstepping in ways that felt invasive. Lucy remained hostile, but less overtly cruel, her resistance shifting from active warfare to stubborn silence. Caleb worked the ranch from dawn until exhaustion forced him back inside, where conversation was spare and careful. Sunday arrived with cloudless skies and heat that promised to intensify as the day progressed. Church was inevitable, a social obligation that couldn't be avoided without generating even more talk than their marriage had already caused. Eleanor emerged from her room dressed in her best dress, dark blue cotton, worn but clean and pressed, with lace at the collar that had been carefully mended multiple times. Her hair was arranged in a softer style than her usual practical knot, and Caleb realized with something like surprise that she was trying, making an effort to present herself well for whatever judgment awaited them. Lucy wore the dress Sarah had made for her 2 years ago, now slightly too short in the sleeves and hem, but still the finest thing she owned. She refused to look at Eleanor, but at least she was ready on time. The church sat at the end of Main Street, a simple white building with a modest steeple. By the time they arrived, most of the congregation was already assembled on the lawn, talking in small groups before the service began. The conversations died as Caleb's wagon approached. Every head turned to watch as he helped Eleanor down, as Lucy jumped off the back without waiting for assistance, as the three of them walked together toward the church entrance. The stairs were heavy, assessing, many of them hostile. Martha Whitmore broke away from a group of women and approached directly, her kind face determinedly cheerful. "Eleanor, how wonderful to see you. That dress is lovely. Is that the lace pattern you were working on last year?" The simple normality of the greeting seemed to shock Eleanor into momentary silence before she recovered. "Yes, I finally finished it." "It's beautiful," Martha said warmly, then turned to Lucy. "And Lucy, look how tall you've gotten. You must have grown 3 inches since I saw you last." She glanced at Caleb, her eyes communicating solidarity. "We're looking forward to having you all for dinner later. The girls have been talking about it all week." Other women had started to drift closer, curiosity overcoming caution. Rebecca Morrison, the judge's wife, offered a stiff but polite greeting. Sarah Fletcher, who ran the dress shop, managed a tight smile. But others, particularly the younger women who'd once been Eleanor's students, kept their distance, their expressions uncomfortable as if unsure whether acknowledging Eleanor would mark them as equally improper. They made it inside and took a seat near the back. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture readings, Reverend Mitchell's sermon on the sanctity of marriage feeling pointed enough that Caleb wondered if he'd specifically chosen it. Beside him, Eleanor sat perfectly straight, her face composed, giving nothing away. After the service, Thomas Whitmore confirmed their dinner invitation with Caleb while Martha drew Eleanor aside, speaking quietly in a way that seemed designed to shield her from other women's more obvious stares. Lucy stood apart, accepting a piece of candy from Mrs. Chen, but otherwise maintaining her stubborn isolation. They were preparing to leave when Harold Pemberton approached, his smile as calculated as ever. "Mrs. Hartley," he said smoothly, "how are you settling into married life?" "Well enough," Eleanor replied, her tone neutral. "Excellent. I'm pleased to see my assistants produce such a satisfactory outcome." His eyes gleamed with something Caleb didn't like. "Of course, now that the immediate crisis is resolved, I assume you'll want to move forward with your school plans?" Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Caleb felt her stiffen beside him. "Eventually, yes." "Wonderful. When you're ready to discuss financing, my door's open. I'm always happy to help ambitious women achieve their goals, provided they have the proper backing, of course." His gaze slid to Caleb, "and the proper permissions from their husbands." "Eleanor doesn't need my permission for anything," Caleb said flatly. "How modern," Pemberton replied, his smile widening. "Though I'm sure the community will be interested to know the ranch is being run with such progressive values." He tipped his hat. "Enjoy your Sunday." He walked away, leaving a sour taste in the air behind him. "That was a threat," Eleanor said quietly, once they were out of earshot. "I know," Caleb replied. "He's reminding us he can still cause problems, still has influence. We need to be careful." "We need to be free of him," Caleb countered, "but I don't know how to make that happen." The dinner at the Whitmores that afternoon provided temporary respite from such dark thoughts. Their home was modest but warm, filled with the comfortable chaos of 4 daughters ranging from 6 to 14. Martha had cooked a feast, roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a pie that made Lucy's eyes widen with undisguised longing. The girls treated Eleanor with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. The oldest, Emily, 14, eventually working up courage to ask if Eleanor might tutor her in mathematics if her parents approved. "I'm going to be a bookkeeper," Emily announced. "Mrs. Hartley taught me that women could do that before the school board made her leave. She said my mind was good with numbers and I shouldn't waste it." "It's still good with numbers," Eleanor said gently, "and I'd be happy to help you if your parents agree." Martha and Thomas exchanged glances. "We'd be grateful," Martha said. "Emily's right that her talents shouldn't go to waste just because she's a girl." Over dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than Caleb had experienced in weeks. Thomas talked about the challenges of farming in drought conditions, comparing notes with Caleb about irrigation and cattle management. Martha discussed the ridiculous new regulations the town council had imposed on what books could be purchased for the lending library. Anything deemed too stimulating for women's delicate sensibilities was now forbidden. They banned Whitman, Martha said with disgust. Said his poetry was inappropriate. Meanwhile, half the men in town spend their evenings drinking and gambling, but that's perfectly acceptable behavior. They don't ban things because they're actually harmful, Eleanor said. They ban them to demonstrate power, to remind certain people, usually women, that they don't control their own access to ideas or information. You sound like you've given this considerable thought, Thomas observed. I've had 3 years to think about why I was really fired, Eleanor replied. The advanced mathematics was just the excuse. The real problem was that I was teaching girls to question authority, to think independently, to imagine lives beyond what this town prescribed for them. That's what made me dangerous. And now you're married to a rancher, Martha said gently. Does that feel like defeat? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Ask me again in a year. Right now it feels like survival. Whether it becomes something more than that. She glanced at Caleb, then away. Time will tell. Lucy, who'd been playing with the younger Whitmore girls, suddenly appeared at Eleanor's elbow. Emily says you taught her about fractions using recipe measurements. Can you show me? It was the first time Lucy had voluntarily spoken to Eleanor with anything approaching curiosity rather than hostility. Eleanor's surprise was visible but quickly masked. Of course, she said carefully. If you'd like. Lucy nodded, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes, then returned to the other children. That's progress, Martha observed quietly. That's Lucy deciding to survive this situation too, Caleb replied. She's practical, like her mother was. The evening ended with promises to gather again soon, with Emily clutching a piece of paper where Eleanor had written out a basic tutoring schedule, with Lucy slightly less withdrawn than she'd been in days. Driving home under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, the three of them shared the wagon in companionable near silence. Lucy had fallen asleep leaning against her father's side, exhausted from playing with children her own age for the first time in months. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly, for today, for not making me face all of that alone. We're in this together, Caleb replied. However it started, whatever forced us here, we're in it together now. That has to mean something. Eleanor looked at him in the starlight, her expression difficult to read. It's starting to, she said finally, mean something. Neither of them was quite ready to define what that something was. But it was there, fragile and uncertain, a possibility neither had expected when they'd stood in Judge Morrison's parlor and spoken vows that felt like a death sentence. At home, Caleb carried Lucy inside and put her to bed while Eleanor banked the fire and prepared the house for night. When he came back downstairs, she was standing by the window, looking out at darkness. I'm going to sleep in the house tonight, Caleb said. In the study, if you're comfortable with that. Lucy shouldn't wake up and see me coming from the barn. It confuses her about what this is. All right, Eleanor agreed. She hesitated, then added, Caleb, what you said to Pemberton today, about me not needing your permission. Did you mean that? Of course I did. Most men wouldn't. Most men would use a marriage like this to control everything their wife did. I'm not most men, Caleb said quietly. And this marriage might have been forced, but I won't make it a prison for either of us if I can help it. Eleanor's eyes shone with something that might have been tears, though she blinked them back quickly. Then perhaps Martha's right. Perhaps there is progress happening here. She went upstairs to her room, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts, and the slow realization that something had shifted in the past week. They weren't friends, weren't lovers, weren't even truly partners yet, but they were becoming something, two people learning to occupy the same space with mutual respect instead of resentment. It wasn't what either of them had wanted, but maybe, in time, it could become enough. The house settled into sleep around him, and Caleb finally allowed himself to hope that survival might eventually transform into something resembling life. That fragile hope lasted exactly 4 days before reality reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. Caleb was working on the south pasture fence when he heard the crack of splintering wood, followed by the terrified bellow of cattle. He ran toward the sound, his heart already racing with the knowledge that whatever had happened was bad. What he found confirmed his worst fears. A section of the main corral had collapsed, likely rotted through from years of neglect he hadn't had time or resources to address, and 3 of his remaining cattle had bolted through the gap toward the open range. He was trying to assess the damage and calculate how quickly he could repair it when his boot caught on a broken plank. The wood gave way beneath him and he went down hard, his left leg twisting at an angle that sent white-hot pain shooting through his knee and up his thigh. He hit the ground with enough force to knock the air from his lungs, his head glancing off a fence post on the way down. For several seconds he lay there, vision blurred, tasting copper in his mouth where he had bitten his tongue. The pain in his leg was intense and getting worse, and when he tried to stand, his knee buckled immediately. He managed to drag himself to the fence line and prop himself against a post, breathing hard, trying to think through the haze of pain. The cattle were gone, scattered to hell and back. The corral was destroyed, and he was injured badly enough that walking was impossible, let alone riding out to retrieve livestock or repair fencing. The ranch work that never stopped, that defined every hour of every day, suddenly felt completely beyond his capacity. He must have blacked out briefly because the next thing he knew, Eleanor was kneeling beside him, her face tight with concern, her hands already examining his leg with surprising confidence. "Don't move," she said sharply when he tried to shift position. "Your knee is badly swollen and you may have hit your head. Lucy saw you fall from the house and came to get me." "The cattle?" Caleb started. "Can wait," Eleanor interrupted. "Right now you're the priority. Can you stand if I help you?" "Tried. Couldn't." Eleanor looked around, assessing the situation with quick efficiency. "All right, Lucy." The girl appeared from behind the barn, her face pale with fear. "Is Papa going to die?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "But he's hurt and we need to get him inside. Run to the Whitmore's place. It's about 2 miles east. Tell Thomas we need help. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded, already turning to run. "Wait," Eleanor called. "Take the horse, faster and safer. You remember how to saddle him?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good girl. Go quickly but carefully. We need Thomas, not another injured person." Lucy ran for the barn, and Eleanor turned back to Caleb. "I'm going to try to stabilize your knee before we move you. This is going to hurt." "How do you know?" Caleb started, then gasped as her hands began probing the swollen joint with practiced precision. "My mother was sick for 2 years before she died," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clinical. "I learned basic medicine out of necessity. This isn't broken, I don't think, but it's a bad sprain at minimum. Could be torn ligaments. You'll need to stay off it completely for at least a week, possibly longer." Her fingers moved to his head, checking the lump that was already forming. "Your pupils are even, which is good. How many fingers am I holding up?" 3. "What day is it?" "Thursday." "Good. You're lucid." She pulled off her shawl and began tearing it into strips. "I'm going to wrap this as tightly as I can to keep it immobile. It's going to hurt worse before it feels better." She wasn't lying. By the time she'd finished binding his knee, Caleb was sweating and nauseated from pain. But the joint felt more stable, less like it might give way completely at any moment. "Now we wait for Thomas," Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels. Her dress was dirty, her hands streaked with dust and blood from where she'd scraped them on the rough wood. "Tell me about the cattle. How many got out?" 3 head. Maybe 4. Hard to tell." Caleb closed his eyes briefly against a wave of dizziness. "Can't afford to lose them. Can't afford to leave them out there either. Coyotes, rustlers, any number of things could happen." "Then we'll get them back," Eleanor said with a certainty he didn't feel. Thomas arrived within the hour, bringing his oldest son Daniel and a flat cart they used for hauling supplies. Between the 3 of them, they managed to get Caleb onto the cart and back to the house, though every jostle sent fresh spikes of agony through his leg. By the time they had him settled on his bed, the one he hadn't slept in since Eleanor arrived, he was gray-faced and trembling. Eleanor had boiled water and gathered clean cloths, moving through the house like she'd lived there for years instead of days. "Thomas, can you and Daniel round up the cattle that got out? I'll pay you for your time once we can—" "No payment necessary," Thomas interrupted. "We help neighbors. That's how things work out here. Daniel, go saddle our horses. We'll track those cattle before nightfall if we can." Thank you, Caleb managed from the bed. Save your strength, Thomas replied. You're going to need it. Healing from something like this takes time, and ranches don't stop needing work just because the rancher's down. He glanced at Eleanor. You know how to dress wounds properly? Yes. Good. Change those wrappings twice a day. Keep the swelling down with cold compresses when you can manage it. He tries to get up before that knee is ready. You knock him back down. Doctor's orders, even if I'm not a doctor. Thomas's weathered face softened slightly. You did good work out there, Eleanor. Quick thinking, proper treatment. Most women would have panicked. Most women haven't had to learn to handle emergencies alone, Eleanor replied quietly. After Thomas and Daniel left, Lucy hovering anxiously by the door, Eleanor set about making Caleb as comfortable as possible. She brought water, adjusted pillows, opened the window to let in air that wasn't stifling. When he tried to sit up to drink, she supported his shoulders with surprising strength. You need to rest, she said when he started trying to plan repairs and cattle retrieval. Your body needs time to heal. Everything else can wait. Ranch doesn't work that way, Caleb protested. Animals need feeding, fences need mending, water troughs need checking. It never stops. Then I'll do it, Eleanor said simply. Caleb stared at her. You don't know the first thing about running a ranch. Then you'll teach me, she replied, that familiar stubborn set to her jaw. I can follow instructions. I can learn. And right now I'm all you've got, so we'd better figure it out quickly. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor proved herself more capable than Caleb would have thought possible. She took detailed notes as he explained the daily routines, what animals needed, what feed, how to check water levels, where tools were kept, which tasks were critical and which could wait. She asked precise questions, never the same one twice, and implemented his instructions with methodical efficiency. Lucy, seeing her father helpless and Eleanor stepping into the gap, began grudgingly helping. She showed Eleanor where feed was stored, how to prime the water pump when it stuck, which chickens were broody and needed careful handling. The two of them developed an unspoken working relationship, not warm but functional, united by the need to keep things running. Thomas and Daniel returned on the third day with 2 of the missing cattle. The third, they reported, had been taken by rustlers. Tracks led north toward the territorial line, where law enforcement was sparse and questions weren't asked about livestock origins. Could be worse, Thomas said to Eleanor, since Caleb was still bedbound and increasingly frustrated by his forced immobility. 3 head lost could have been the whole herd. The corral's going to need complete rebuilding, though. Probably a 2-man job, minimum 3 days of work. Can you help? Eleanor asked. I'll pay standard rates. We have some money saved from... She hesitated, unwilling to mention Pemberton's name. I can spare a day or 2, Thomas agreed. Daniel, too. We'll get the critical repairs done, at least enough to keep the remaining cattle secure. That afternoon, while Thomas worked on the corral, Eleanor sat at Caleb's bedside with paper and pencil, making calculations. Her face was drawn with concentration and worry. We lost $60 in cattle value, she said finally. The corral repairs will cost another $30 in materials, even with Thomas donating labor. We're barely breaking even as it is. And now this. She set down the pencil. How close are we to falling back into the kind of debt that brought us to this situation in the first place? Too close, Caleb admitted. The forced inactivity had given him too much time to think, to calculate, to worry. We needed those cattle for breeding stock. Without them, rebuilding the herd gets pushed back another year, maybe more. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the numbers she'd written. What if I went to Pemberton for that school loan? He offered, and if I could get the school running, it would provide steady income. Not much, but something. Enough to help. No, Caleb said immediately. We're not going deeper into debt to that man. That's how this whole nightmare started. Then what do you suggest? Eleanor's voice was sharp with frustration. Because from where I'm sitting, we have very few options. You can't work for at least another week, probably 2. I can keep things from falling apart, but I can't do the heavy labor needed to actually run a ranch. We're losing money every day, and winter's coming. We need a plan that isn't just hoping things magically improve. She was right, and Caleb knew it, which made the truth even harder to swallow. I don't have an answer, he admitted. Not a good one. Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to the window. Her shoulders were rigid with tension. I'm not going back to how things were before we married. I won't be poor and powerless again, dependent on charity and pity. If that means swallowing my pride and dealing with Pemberton, then that's what I'll do. He'll use it against you, Caleb warned. Against us. You know he will. Let him try, Eleanor said, and there was steel in her voice Caleb hadn't heard before. I'm tired of being afraid of men like Harold Pemberton. Tired of letting them dictate my life because they hold money over my head like a weapon. Maybe it's time someone pushed back. Before Caleb could respond, Lucy appeared in the doorway, her face urgent. Mrs. Hartley, there's a man here. Says his name is Mr. Pemberton, and he needs to speak with you and Papa right away. Eleanor and Caleb exchanged looks that communicated volumes without words. Show him in, Eleanor said quietly. And Lucy, stay close. In the kitchen where you can hear but he can't see you. I want a witness to whatever he says. Lucy nodded and disappeared. A moment later, Pemberton entered, his suit as immaculate as ever despite the dust of the road, his expression one of calculated concern. Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Hartley, he said smoothly. I heard about your accident, Caleb. Terrible business. How are you recovering? Slowly, Caleb replied, not bothering to hide his distrust. What do you want, Pemberton? So direct, Pemberton said with a small smile. I'm here as a concerned citizen and, dare I say, benefactor. Your marriage arrangement was, after all, brokered through my good offices. I feel some responsibility for your well-being. His eyes moved to Eleanor. I understand you've been managing the ranch in your husband's absence from work. Quite impressive for someone with no experience in such matters. I'm a fast learner, Eleanor said evenly. Indeed. Which brings me to my purpose. Pemberton settled into the chair by Caleb's bed without being invited. Word travels fast in a small community. I've heard about your cattle loss, the corral damage, the financial strain this places on an already precarious situation. I'm here to offer assistance. We don't need your help, Caleb said flatly. Don't you? Pemberton's eyebrows rose. Because from where I sit, you're one more disaster away from losing everything again. What happens if you can't work for a month? 2 months? What if the knee doesn't heal properly and you're permanently limited in what labor you can perform? You're one man trying to run an operation that really requires two, and while I admire Mrs. Hartley's efforts, surely even she would admit she's not qualified to manage a ranch long term. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, but her voice remained calm. What exactly are you offering, Mr. Pemberton? A loan, Pemberton said simply. Enough to hire proper help, buy replacement cattle, make necessary repairs. Standard interest rates, reasonable repayment terms, all perfectly legitimate and above board. Like the last loan was legitimate? Caleb asked bitterly. The one with hidden terms and accelerated payment schedules that somehow never got mentioned until I was drowning in debt? Pemberton's expression didn't change. That was an unfortunate misunderstanding. This would be different, I assure you. In fact, I'm prepared to offer even more favorable terms if Mrs. Hartley agrees to something I've been considering. Here it comes, Eleanor said quietly. Pemberton smiled. You're perceptive. Yes, here it comes. I'm proposing a business arrangement, Mrs. Hartley. You want to open a school. I'm willing to finance it completely. Building, supplies, everything you need. In exchange, the school operates under my oversight. I select which families children attend, I approve curriculum, and I receive a percentage of any tuition collected. So you control everything, and I'm just a figurehead, Eleanor said flatly. You're an educator doing what you love, Pemberton corrected. With financial security and community standing restored. It's a generous offer. It's a cage, Eleanor replied. A prettier version of the one you forced me into when you arranged this marriage, but a cage nonetheless. You'd use the school to control which families are in your favor, who gets the privilege of education and who doesn't. You dictate what gets taught and what doesn't, turning it into a tool for maintaining the exact power structures I was fired for challenging in the first place. Pemberton's smile hardened slightly. You're dramatizing. I'm simply being a prudent businessman, protecting my investment. Your investment in controlling this town, Eleanor said, in making sure people stay dependent on you, grateful to you, afraid to cross you. She moved closer to where he sat, her voice dropping but intensifying. I know what you did with Caleb's loan. I've been going through the papers, the ones you supposedly destroyed. You kept copies, didn't you? I found them in your clerk's office. He's not as loyal as you think, by the way. I saw the altered terms, the illegally accelerated payment schedule, the interest calculations that violate territorial lending laws. The room went very quiet. Pemberton's expression had frozen, calculating. That's quite an accusation, he said softly. I hope you have proof. I have copies, Eleanor said. Signed, dated, witnessed, and I've sent them to the Territorial Banking Commission in Helena along with a formal complaint detailing your fraudulent practices. She paused. That's not all. I've been talking to other families in Silver Ridge, at least 7 others who took loans from you under similar circumstances, with the same patterns of manipulation and illegal terms. They're willing to testify if it comes to that. Caleb stared at his wife, this woman he barely knew, who'd apparently been conducting an investigation while simultaneously learning to run a ranch and care for an invalid husband. Eleanor? What did you do? What needed doing? She replied, not taking her eyes off Pemberton. I spent 2 years watching this man destroy people's lives while hiding behind a veneer of respectability. I wasn't going to let him do it to anyone else, including us. Pemberton stood slowly, his face darkening. You foolish woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? The Banking Commission won't care about your complaints. I have connections, influence. You've made a powerful enemy. I've exposed a criminal, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. This is a letter from the Commission acknowledging receipt of my complaint and informing me they're opening an investigation. It arrived yesterday. They take fraud seriously, Mr. Pemberton, especially fraud that affects multiple families across county lines. You'll regret this, Pemberton said, his voice dropping to something ugly and threatening. Both of you. I'll make sure of it. Leave my house, Caleb said, surprised by the strength in his own voice despite his helplessness. Now. Pemberton looked between them, his expression calculating and cold. This isn't over. Not by a long measure. He moved toward the door, then paused. You should know, Mrs. Hartley, that there are other ways to destroy someone besides financial ruin. Reputation, for instance. Social standing. I could make it so no family in this county would send their children to any school you opened. I could make it so you're both pariahs, unable to buy supplies, hire help, or do business with anyone. Would you like to see how that feels? Do your worst, Eleanor said quietly. At least we'll be able to look at ourselves in the mirror. After he left, the silence in the room was deafening. Lucy emerged from the kitchen, her eyes wide. Was that true? She asked Eleanor. About the papers and the investigation? Yes, Eleanor replied, suddenly looking exhausted. She sank into the chair Pemberton had vacated, her hands shaking slightly now that the confrontation was over. Why didn't you tell me? Caleb asked, not sure whether to be angry or impressed. Because you would have tried to stop me, Eleanor said, or insisted on being involved when you couldn't be, given your injury, and because, she hesitated, because I needed to know I could do this, that I wasn't powerless, that marriage to you didn't mean surrendering every bit of independence I had left. You could have gotten us killed, Caleb said. Pemberton's not the kind of man who takes losing lightly. I know, Eleanor replied. Believe me, I know, but living in fear of men like him is just another kind of death. A slower one, maybe, but death of the spirit nonetheless. I won't do it anymore. I can't. Lucy moved closer to Eleanor, studying her with new eyes. You stood up to him, she said wonderingly. Even though you were scared, I could see you shaking. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, Eleanor said softly. It means being scared and doing what's right anyway. Your mother understood that. It's one of the things I wish I'd been able to tell her. Something shifted in Lucy's expression, the last of her hostility cracking like ice in spring thaw. You knew my mama. A little. She came to the school once before I was fired, wanted to ask if I'd tutor you in mathematics when you were old enough. Said she wanted you to have opportunities she never did, to know your mind was valuable. Eleanor's voice was gentle. She loved you very much. That was obvious in everything she said. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. I miss her. Of course you do, Eleanor said. And you always will. But missing her doesn't mean you can't also accept other people into your life. It's not betrayal to keep living, keep growing. It's honoring her by becoming the person she hoped you'd be. The girl crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around Eleanor's neck in a sudden, fierce embrace. Eleanor looked startled for a moment. Then her arms came up to hold Lucy close, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Caleb watched them from the bed. These two people who'd been forced into his life by circumstances beyond their control, now clinging to each other in shared understanding of loss and survival. Something in his chest felt too large for the space available, pressing against his ribs until he could barely breathe. "Eleanor," he said quietly, and both of them turned to look at him. "What you did, investigating Pemberton, gathering evidence, protecting not just us but other families too, that took courage I didn't know anyone had. Thank you." Eleanor wiped her eyes quickly. "Don't thank me yet. We don't know how this ends. The investigation could take months. Pemberton could find ways to retaliate before anything comes of it. I may have just made everything worse. Or you might have saved us," Caleb replied. "Saved all of us. Not just from debt, but from living under his thumb forever. That's worth the risk." Over the next few days, they learned just how seriously Pemberton took the threat. Word spread through town about Eleanor's complaint with remarkable speed. Pemberton's doing clearly intended to isolate them socially before any official judgment came down. Several families who'd previously been friendly suddenly became unavailable. The general store owner started adding unexplained charges to their account. The farrier refused to shoe their horse, claiming he was too busy. But for every door that closed, another unexpectedly opened. Thomas and Martha Whitmore became even more supportive, bringing food and helping with repairs. Mrs. Chen, the widow who'd shown them kindness from the beginning, organized other families who'd been victimized by Pemberton's lending practices, creating a network of mutual support and shared testimony. 3 other ranchers approached Caleb, carefully, quietly, to thank Eleanor for doing what they'd been too afraid to do themselves. "You're not alone in this," one of them said, an older man named Samuel Hartford, whose family had lost half their land to Pemberton's schemes. "He's been bleeding this county dry for years. Someone needed to stand up to him. Guess it took a woman with nothing left to lose to have the spine for it." Eleanor, overhearing this, smiled grimly. "I have plenty to lose now. That's what makes it terrifying, but also necessary." Caleb's knee healed slowly, the swelling gradually subsiding under Eleanor's careful treatment. By the end of the 2nd week, he could stand with support, hobble a few steps before pain forced him to stop. It wasn't enough to resume full ranch work, but it was progress. Lucy, meanwhile, had transformed completely in her treatment of Eleanor. She asked questions about Eleanor's teaching days, about the books she'd read, about what it had been like growing up without parents. She helped with household chores without being asked, and started requesting that Eleanor teach her the mathematics her mother had wanted her to learn. "If you're going to open a school," Lucy said one evening at dinner, "I want to be your first student, even if Papa's the only one who'll let their kid attend because of what people say." "We'll see," Eleanor replied, but her expression was soft. "First, we need to survive whatever Pemberton tries next. Then we can think about schools." What Pemberton tried next came on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Caleb's injury. 2 men arrived at the ranch claiming to be territorial inspectors, asserting they had complaints about unsafe livestock management and unsanitary conditions that violated territorial agricultural standards. Eleanor met them at the door, Caleb limping out to stand beside her despite his knee's protests. "We've had no notice of inspection," Eleanor said coolly. "Territorial law requires 48 hours advance warning except in cases of immediate public health risk. Are you claiming immediate risk?" The inspectors exchanged glances. "We're claiming we received complaints." "From Harold Pemberton, no doubt," Eleanor interrupted, "who's currently under investigation by the Territorial Banking Commission for fraud. Forgive me if I question your timing and motivation." She crossed her arms. "I've documented every aspect of this ranch's operations for the past 3 weeks. Feed quality, water sources, livestock health, waste management, everything. You're welcome to inspect, but I'll be taking my own notes on your inspection, and I'll be filing them with the Territorial Agriculture Board along with a complaint about harassment." The inspectors looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're just doing our jobs." Then do them properly, Eleanor said sharply. Conduct your inspection by the book, document your findings accurately, and leave politics out of it. Otherwise, leave now, and I'll report this attempted intimidation to your superiors. They conducted the inspection, found nothing actionable, though they clearly tried, left with sour expressions and the knowledge that Eleanor Brooks Hartley was not a woman who intimidated easily. You're terrifying, Caleb told her after they'd gone, in the best possible way. I'm surviving, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. But she smiled when she said it, and for the first time since their forced marriage, the smile reached her eyes. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed and Caleb sat by the fire trying to keep weight off his still-healing knee, Eleanor joined him with 2 cups of coffee. I've been thinking, she said, settling into the chair across from him, about what we are, what this marriage is. Caleb's heart beat faster. And? I think we're partners, Eleanor said simply. Not in the way either of us planned or wanted initially, but partners nonetheless. We protect each other, support each other, face threats together instead of alone. She met his eyes directly. That's more than many marriages that start with love ever achieve. Maybe it's enough. Is it enough for you? Caleb asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question seriously. Ask me again when this is over, when we know if Pemberton's investigation leads anywhere, if we can actually build something stable here, right now. She paused. Right now, it's more than I had 3 weeks ago. That makes it precious, even if it's not perfect. They sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee, watching flames flicker in the hearth. Outside, the ranch settled into night. Animals secure, fences mended enough to hold, crops struggling but surviving. 2 people who'd been strangers, learning slowly to be something more. It wasn't the romance song celebrated or stories immortalized, but it was real. Built on respect and shared struggle and the gradual understanding that sometimes the most powerful bonds formed not from choice, but from facing impossible situations together and refusing to break. The forced vow had brought them together. But what they were building now, that was entirely their own. The partnership Eleanor had named that night by the fire was tested sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Caleb was attempting his first full day of light ranch work when a rider came up the road at speed, dust trailing behind his horse like smoke. It was Daniel Whitmore, Thomas's son, his young face flushed with urgency. "Mr. Hartley! Mrs. Hartley!" he called, barely waiting for his horse to stop before dismounting. "Pa sent me. Says you need to get to town immediately. There's trouble." Eleanor emerged from the house, wiping flour from her hands. "What kind of trouble?" The Territorial Banking Commission sent 2 investigators to Silver Ridge. They've been at the bank all morning going through records. Mr. Pemberton's been arrested. The words hung in the air for a moment, too large to fully comprehend. Caleb and Eleanor exchanged glances that communicated shock, relief, and wariness in equal measure. "Arrested?" Caleb repeated. "On what charges?" "Don't know exactly. Pa said something about fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The investigators want to speak with anyone who filed complaints or has information about Pemberton's lending practices. Your name came up first, Mrs. Hartley. They're asking for you specifically." Eleanor's face had gone pale, but composed. "How long ago did this happen?" "Maybe an hour. Pa thought you'd want to know right away." "Lucy," Eleanor called toward the house, "come here, please." The girl appeared, her expression immediately concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Eleanor said carefully. "But I need to go into town, something important. Will you be all right here with your father for a few hours?" Lucy nodded, looking between the adults with worried eyes. "Is this about Mr. Pemberton? About what you did?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "And I need to face whatever comes next. But I need you to be brave while I'm gone. Can you do that?" "I can," Lucy said, drawing herself up straighter. "I'll take care of Papa." Caleb started toward the barn. "I'm coming with you." "Your knee," Eleanor began. "Can handle sitting in a wagon," Caleb interrupted firmly. "You're not doing this alone. We're partners, remember? That means facing things together." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. Gratitude, affection, something deeper she wasn't ready to name yet. "All right, together." They made the journey to town in Daniel's company, the young man filling them in on what little else he knew. Pemberton had apparently tried to destroy records when the investigators arrived, which had led to immediate arrest. The bank was closed, the building surrounded by a small crowd of townspeople trying to understand what was happening. Silver Ridge's main street was more crowded than Caleb had seen it in months. People clustered in groups, talking in urgent voices, their faces showing everything from satisfaction to concern to outright fear. Many of the families present were ones Caleb recognized as being in debt to Pemberton's bank, their futures suddenly uncertain now that their creditor was in custody. The territorial investigators had taken over the judge's office as a temporary headquarters. They were middle-aged men in dark suits, their expressions professionally neutral, their manners suggesting they'd done this kind of work before. The older of the two introduced himself as Marcus Wheeler, chief examiner for the Territorial Banking Commission. "Mrs. Hartley," Wheeler said, studying Eleanor with sharp eyes. "Your complaint was quite detailed, impressively so for someone without legal training." "I'm thorough," Eleanor replied evenly, "and motivated. Indeed, we've spent the morning reviewing Mr. Pemberton's records. What we've found confirms your allegations, and then some. Fraudulent loan terms, forged documents, embezzlement of depositors' funds, conspiracy to manipulate property sales for personal profit. The man was running a criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate banking." Wheeler gestured for them to sit. "We need your testimony, Mrs. Hartley. Everything you discovered, how you discovered it, and any additional information you can provide about other victims or illegal practices." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor walked the investigators through her findings with remarkable precision. She produced the copies she'd made of Pemberton's fraudulent documents, explained how she'd gained access through the clerk who'd grown disgusted with his employer's practices, detailed conversations with other affected families. Caleb watched her with growing admiration. This woman who'd been dismissed as an unemployable spinster was systematically dismantling a man who'd terrorized the county for years. "And your own situation?" Wheeler asked. "Wheeler, the marriage arrangement Pemberton orchestrated between you and Mr. Hartley?" Eleanor's hands tightened briefly in her lap. "Was coercive and exploitative. He used my desperation and Mr. Hartley's debt to force an arrangement that benefited his own interests, removing a woman who'd become an inconvenience while ensuring control over a valuable property and its owner." "Would you characterize it as fraud?" Eleanor glanced at Caleb, something unreadable in her expression. "I would characterize it as a man using power and desperation as weapons against people who had no other choices. Whether that constitutes legal fraud, I leave for you to determine." Wheeler made notes. "And the current status of your marriage? Given that it was entered under duress?" The question hung heavy in the air. Caleb found himself holding his breath, waiting for Eleanor's response. "The marriage is valid under territorial law," Eleanor said carefully. "How Mr. Hartley and I have chosen to navigate the circumstances of its creation is our private business. But I won't lie. Pemberton manipulated both of us into a situation neither wanted. That should be part of your investigation." After the interview concluded, Wheeler thanked them for their cooperation and indicated they might be called to provide testimony if the case went to trial. "Mr. Pemberton is currently being held in Helena pending formal charges. Given the severity and scope of what we've uncovered, I expect those charges to be substantial." Outside, the afternoon sun was harsh and bright. Caleb and Eleanor stood on the judge's porch, watching the crowd that still milled on the street below. Many eyes turned toward them, some grateful, some resentful, some simply curious. "That question about our marriage," Caleb said quietly, "about it being fraudulent, you could have said yes, could have found a way to end this, now that Pemberton's locked up and the debt's resolved." Eleanor turned to look at him, her face serious. "Is that what you want? An annulment? Freedom from a marriage you were forced into?" The question should have been easy to answer. 3 weeks ago it would have been. But standing there, looking at this woman who'd faced down corrupt bankers and territorial investigators with equal composure, who'd learned to run a ranch she knew nothing about, who'd somehow found space in her heart for his grieving daughter, Caleb realized the answer had become impossibly complicated. "I don't know," he admitted. "Do you?" "I don't know either," Eleanor replied softly. Isn't that strange? A month ago, I would have called this marriage a prison. Now it feels more like possibility, something undefined that could become whatever we choose to make it. She paused. But that only works if we're both choosing it freely, not because we're trapped, but because we actually want to. Before Caleb could respond, Martha Whitmore appeared, pushing through the crowd with determined purpose. Eleanor, Caleb, thank heavens. We need to talk. She glanced around at the watching faces. Privately, they followed her to the Whitmore's wagon, where Thomas waited with several other ranchers and farmers Caleb recognized, the ones who'd been quietly grateful for Eleanor's courage in confronting Pemberton. There's a problem, Thomas said without preamble. With Pemberton arrested and the bank closed, everyone who had accounts there can't access their money. Everyone who had loans doesn't know who owns the debt now. The whole county's financial system just collapsed. The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. How long until the commission sorts it out? Could be months, one of the other ranchers said. Meanwhile, people can't pay their bills, can't buy supplies for winter, can't do business. Some folks are already talking about leaving, heading west or south, where there's functioning banks and less chaos. We need an alternative, Martha said, looking directly at Eleanor. A way for people to access credit, to conduct business, to keep the community functioning until the territorial government figures out what to do with Pemberton's mess. I'm not a banker, Eleanor protested. No, but you're the one person in Silver Ridge who proved she could stand up to corruption and organize people around a common cause, Thomas replied. And you're educated, which most of us aren't. You understand how these things work. What exactly are you proposing? Caleb asked warily. A cooperative, Martha said. Families pooling resources, extending credit to each other based on mutual trust instead of a bank's terms. It's been done in other territories. Eleanor could help organize it, manage the record keeping. We'd all have a say in how it operates, but someone needs to coordinate. Someone people trust. Eleanor looked overwhelmed. I wouldn't even know where to start. Yes, you would, Martha said gently. You started by taking down Pemberton. This is just the next step, building something better to replace what he destroyed. Over the next several days, what began as a desperate stopgap measure transformed into something more substantial. Eleanor recruited Samuel Hartford, the older rancher who'd thanked her for standing up to Pemberton, to help establish basic lending principles. Mrs. Chen offered her small savings as seed capital and brought in several other widows willing to do the same. The Whitmores provided organizational support and their home as a meeting place. Eleanor threw herself into the work with fierce concentration, drafting bylaws for the cooperative, establishing fair interest rates, creating transparent record-keeping systems that prevented the kind of manipulation Pemberton had practiced. She consulted legal texts borrowed from Judge Morrison, corresponded with cooperative banking operations in other territories, worked late into the night by lamplight making sure everything was documented properly. Caleb watched her transform from a woman trying to survive into a force reshaping their community's future. And somewhere in that transformation, something shifted in how he saw her, not as the stranger he'd been forced to marry, but as a partner whose strength and intelligence commanded genuine respect and something deeper he wasn't quite ready to examine. Lucy noticed, too. She's amazing, the girl said one evening, watching Eleanor explain lending terms to a group of nervous farmers. Mama was soft and kind. Eleanor's like steel. Both good, just different. Yeah, Caleb agreed quietly. Different. The cooperative's first official meeting was held in the church basement on a Saturday afternoon. Nearly 40 families crowded into a space meant for half that number. Eleanor stood at the front, her plain dress and practical manner somehow lending her authority that fancy clothes never could have. What we're building here, she said, her voice clear and steady, isn't just about money. It's about proving that we don't need men like Pemberton to survive, that we can create systems based on mutual support instead of exploitation, that our community's strength comes from trusting each other, not from being afraid of whoever holds power over us. There were murmurs of agreement, heads nodding. Several people asked questions about interest rates, about what happened if someone couldn't repay a loan, about how decisions would be made. Eleanor answered each one patiently, referring to the bylaws she'd drafted, explaining how democratic governance would prevent any single person from wielding the kind of control Pemberton had maintained. "And if this fails?" someone asked from the back. "If we can't make it work?" "Then we'll have tried," Eleanor replied simply. "We'll have proven that we're capable of more than just accepting whatever circumstances powerful men force upon us. That alone makes it worth attempting." By the meeting's end, 32 families had signed on as cooperative members, pooling modest resources that together created a functioning credit system. It wasn't perfect. There would be mistakes, learning curves, families who struggled with their obligations, but it was theirs, built on principles of transparency and mutual support rather than predatory lending. As people filed out, many stopped to thank Eleanor personally. Women who'd once whispered about her behind her back now shook her hand with genuine respect. Men who'd dismissed her as an uppity spinster acknowledged that maybe education and sharp thinking had value after all. Caleb found her afterward, sitting alone in the empty basement, looking exhausted but satisfied. "You did something remarkable today," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "We did something remarkable," Eleanor corrected. "This wasn't just me. It was everyone who decided they'd had enough of being powerless. You gave them the framework to act on that feeling," Caleb replied. "Without you, they would have just stayed angry and helpless. You showed them another way." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said, "When I was teaching, I used to tell my students that knowledge was power, that education could change their lives. The school board hated that message, said I was filling girls' heads with dangerous ideas. But it was true then, and it's true now. The only difference is now I'm applying it beyond classroom walls." "You miss teaching," Caleb observed. "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "I miss watching young minds grasp new concepts. Miss the moment when something clicks and you can see their whole world expand. The cooperative work is satisfying, but it's not the same." "So open your school," Caleb said. "We've got the ranch stable now. The cooperative's functioning. You've proven yourself to this community 10 times over. Who's going to stop you?" "Money," Eleanor replied practically. "Buildings cost money. Supplies cost money. I won't take a loan from the cooperative when families need it for survival. That would be exploitative in its own way." Caleb had been thinking about this, turning it over in his mind during the long hours of ranch work. What if we used part of the ranch? The old equipment shed, the one we're not using. It's solid, weatherproof. We could convert it into a one-room schoolhouse. Wouldn't be fancy, but it would be functional. Eleanor stared at him. "You'd do that? Give up valuable storage space so I could teach?" "It's not my space to give," Caleb said. "It's our space. Our ranch, our decisions, our future. If teaching is what you need to be fully alive, then we find a way to make it happen." Something in Eleanor's expression cracked open, vulnerability showing through her usual composure. "Why are you being so generous? You didn't want this marriage, didn't want me, yet you keep giving me pieces of your life like they cost you nothing." "They don't cost me nothing," Caleb replied quietly. "But they're worth it. You're worth it. I'm starting to understand that." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "When Sarah died, I thought I'd lost the only partner I'd ever have. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone even if I remarried because nobody could fill that space. I was wrong. You don't fill Sarah's space. You've created your own. Different, but equally important. And I'm grateful for that, even if the circumstances that brought you here were terrible." Eleanor's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I never expected to matter to anyone again. Certainly never expected to matter to you. This was supposed to be survival, nothing more. When did it become something else?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "Somewhere between you facing down Pemberton and teaching my daughter that strength comes in different forms. Somewhere between you learning to feed cattle and organizing half the county to rebuild their financial system. Somewhere in all those small moments where you could have given up, but didn't." They sat in the quiet basement, afternoon light filtering through high windows, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down like summer heat. Finally, Eleanor reached across the small space between their chairs and took Caleb's hand. Her fingers were rough from ranch work, ink-stained from hours of writing bylaws and correspondence, but they fit against his palm like they belonged there. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared of wanting this. Scared that if I let myself care about you, about Lucy, about the life we're building, it'll be taken away somehow. That I'll lose everything again. I'm scared too, Caleb replied. Scared of betraying Sarah's memory. Scared of admitting that what started as a forced arrangement is becoming something I actively want. Scared that I'm not good enough for what you deserve. What if we're both scared together? Eleanor suggested. What if we stop trying to figure out what this should be and just let it become whatever it naturally wants to? Caleb squeezed her hand gently. I think I'd like that. They walked home in the late afternoon, the ranch appearing on the horizon like a promise. Lucy was waiting on the porch, waving when she saw them, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb felt like he was coming home to something whole instead of returning to a place haunted by absence. Over the next 2 weeks, they converted the equipment shed into a functional schoolhouse. Thomas and Daniel helped with the heavy work, building desks from scrap lumber and installing a wood stove for winter heating. Martha donated textbooks from when her daughters were younger. Other families contributed slates, chalk, paper, whatever supplies they could spare. Eleanor spent hours organizing the space, creating a curriculum that balanced practical skills with the academic rigor she believed every child deserved. She posted a notice at the general store advertising the school: free tuition for cooperative member families, modest fees for others, no child turned away for inability to pay. The responses were mixed. 7 families immediately enrolled children. 3 others expressed interest but hesitated, uncertain whether Eleanor's teaching style would be acceptable. 2 families explicitly refused, still viewing her as improper despite everything she'd accomplished. 7 students, Eleanor said the evening before the school's opening day, trying to sound optimistic. That's a start. That's 7 minds you get to shape, Caleb corrected. 7 futures you'll influence. Seems like enough to me. Lucy, who'd been first on the enrollment list, was practically vibrating with excitement. I'll help the younger ones with their letters, she announced. I remember being scared on my first day. I can make them feel less scared. Eleanor pulled the girl into a quick embrace. You're going to be an excellent assistant teacher. The first day of school dawned clear and cold, autumn asserting itself after the brutal summer. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best teaching dress, the one she'd worn years ago when she believed education could change the world. Maybe it still could, just in smaller, more incremental ways. The 7 students arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some eager, some shy, some clearly sent by parents who weren't entirely certain about the decision. Eleanor greeted each one individually, learning their names, asking about their interests, making them feel seen and valued before the actual instruction began. Caleb watched from the barn as Eleanor rang the bell that would start the school day, watched as children filed into the converted shed that now represented dreams rebuilt from ruins. His wife, because that's what she truly was now, not just legally but emotionally, stood in the doorway, framed by morning light, and looked more at home than he'd ever seen her. Lucy emerged at lunchtime, her face flushed with happiness. Eleanor's teaching us real mathematics, Papa, not just how to add sums for household accounts, but actual algebra. She says our brains are capable of complex thinking and we shouldn't settle for simple just because it's easier. Sounds like Eleanor, Caleb replied with a smile. That evening, after the students had gone home and Eleanor had finished organizing for the next day's lessons, they sat together on the porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The ranch stretched out before them, no longer just Caleb's burden but something they shared, their land, their home, their future. I got a letter today, Eleanor said quietly, from the Territorial Banking Commission. They wanted to update me on Pemberton's case. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. And? He's being charged with 17 counts of fraud, 8 counts of forgery, and multiple counts of conspiracy and embezzlement. They estimate he stole over $50,000 from depositors and defrauded at least 30 families across 3 counties. If convicted, he'll spend the rest of his life in territorial prison. Do they need you to testify? Probably. The trial's scheduled for next spring. They'll send notice when they need me in Helena. Eleanor paused. The letter also said something else, that my testimony and documentation were instrumental in building their case, that without what I provided, Pemberton might have destroyed enough evidence to escape prosecution. You took down a criminal who'd been operating unchecked for years, Caleb said. That's not nothing, Eleanor. I know, she replied, but it doesn't erase how we got here. Doesn't change that our marriage started as coercion, as his manipulation. Some things can't be undone, only acknowledged and moved past. Caleb turned to face her directly. I've been thinking about that, about choice versus circumstance, about what we owe each other now that we're not trapped anymore. He took a deep breath. Eleanor Brooks Hartley, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, not based on fear or obligation or what you think I want to hear. Eleanor's expression grew wary. All right, Sut. If you could go back, Caleb said carefully, if you could undo this marriage, start over without any of the coercion or forced circumstances, would you? The question hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Eleanor was silent for a long time, her face turned toward the darkening horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. A month ago, I would have said yes without hesitation, would have taken any escape from a marriage I didn't choose and a life I didn't want. She turned to meet his eyes. But now I'm teaching again, building something meaningful with the cooperative, living in a home where I'm respected and valued, raising a daughter who's starting to feel like mine in ways that have nothing to do with law or obligation. She paused. And I'm married to a man who sees me as an equal partner rather than property or burden. So no, if I could go back, I wouldn't undo this. I'd still hate how it started, but I wouldn't trade where it's brought me. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. I wouldn't either, he admitted. Trade it, I mean. You saved this ranch and probably my soul. Showed Lucy what strength looks like in someone other than her mother. Showed me that partnership doesn't have to look the way I thought it did. That love can grow from respect and shared purpose even when it doesn't start with romance. Love, Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word. Is that what this is? I think so, Caleb replied. Not the wild, passionate kind poets write about. Something quieter, but deeper. Built on choice we're making every day to stay, to build together, to become something more than what we were forced to be. Eleanor reached for his hand again, that gesture that was becoming familiar and precious. I think that's the best kind of love, the kind that's chosen deliberately instead of falling into it by accident, the kind that's earned through seeing each other at worst and deciding the best is worth staying for. They sat in the gathering darkness, hands joined, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Montana sky. Inside the house, Lucy sang to herself while washing dinner dishes. In the converted shed schoolhouse, 7 desks waited for tomorrow's lessons. On the ranch around them, cattle grazed and fences held, and life continued in all its difficult, beautiful complexity. The forced vow that had brought them together had been transformed, alchemy of daily choice and mutual respect converting coercion into something genuine. They weren't the same people who'd stood in Judge Morrison's parlor speaking words that felt like death sentences. They'd been forged by hardship into something stronger, more resilient, more honestly bound to each other than any legal document could mandate. Tomorrow I want to kiss you, Caleb said suddenly, surprising himself with the boldness. Not because we're supposed to be married, but because I want to, because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I'm tired of pretending that respect is the only thing I feel. Eleanor's breath caught, her hand tightening around his. Tomorrow, she asked, and there was something playful in her voice he'd never heard before. Why not tonight? Because tonight I want you to have time to think about it, Caleb replied. To be absolutely certain it's what you want, not what you think I need or what circumstance demands. Tomorrow, when you've had time to be sure, I'll ask properly, and whatever you answer will be the right one. Eleanor stood, tugging him up beside her despite his still tender knee. Caleb Hartley, she said, her voice low and intense, I've spent 3 weeks learning that you're a man of honor who keeps his word. So I'm going to tell you right now, with absolute certainty and no time needed for contemplation, tomorrow when you ask, my answer will be yes. She squeezed his hand once more, then went inside, leaving Caleb standing on the porch with his heart racing and a smile he couldn't suppress spreading across his face. Inside, Eleanor leaned against the closed door, her own heart pounding. She'd spent 2 years believing she'd never matter to anyone again. that her only value lay in whatever practical skills she could offer. But here was a man who saw her intelligence as an asset, her strength as attractive, her independence as something to nurture rather than crush. Here was a partnership that had started in darkness but somehow found its way toward light. Tomorrow he would kiss her, and it would be the first kiss of her life given and received freely, without transaction or coercion or the weight of others' expectations. Tomorrow they would choose each other again, but this time with full hearts instead of desperate resignation. For tonight, it was enough to know that choice was coming, to know that what had been forced was becoming freely chosen, to know that sometimes the worst beginnings could transform into the best continuations if people were brave enough to keep building despite the foundation they'd been given. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, their room soon, maybe, when they were both ready for that step, and allowed herself to hope for a future she hadn't dared imagine just weeks ago. A future where she wasn't just surviving but thriving, where teaching and partnership and love could coexist, where the woman once dismissed as an old maid became someone essential and valued and genuinely wanted. The forced vow had become something precious after all. Tomorrow came with the kind of crystalline autumn morning that made Montana feel like the edge of heaven, air so clear it hurt to breathe, sky so blue it seemed impossible, and frost coating everything in silver that would burn away by noon. Caleb woke before dawn, as always, but this morning his heart was already racing before his feet touched the floor. He found Eleanor in the kitchen, already dressed and braiding her hair by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, and something passed between them that needed no words. Acknowledgement, anticipation, a shared understanding that today marked a turning point they were both choosing deliberately. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled slightly as they worked through the braid. "Morning," Caleb replied. "You sleep all right?" "Not particularly," Eleanor admitted. "Too much thinking." "Second thoughts?" She met his eyes directly. "Not the kind you're worried about. More like first thoughts, really. About what it means to want something this much, after convincing myself for so long that want was a luxury I couldn't afford." She secured the end of her braid with practiced efficiency. "I'm not afraid of you, Caleb. I'm afraid of how much I've come to care. That's different." Before Caleb could respond, Lucy appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is it school day already?" "Not for another 2 hours," Eleanor said gently. "Go back to bed if you want. I'll call you when breakfast is ready." But Lucy had caught something in the air between the adults, some tension or awareness that made her curious. "You're both acting strange. Did something happen?" "Nothing bad," Caleb assured her. "Just adults being complicated about simple things. Go on, get dressed if you're up. We've got a full day ahead." Lucy studied them both with the unnerving perception children sometimes displayed, then shrugged and headed back upstairs. The moment she was gone, Eleanor released a breath she'd been holding. "We should probably wait until she's at school," Eleanor said, "before we have that conversation, that kiss, whatever we're calling it." "Agreed," Caleb replied, though waiting felt like torture now that he'd made up his mind. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something first, though. Something important." She turned to face him fully, giving him her complete attention the way she did when something mattered. "All right. If we do this," Caleb said carefully, "if we stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement and admit it's become something real, it changes everything. No more separate rooms, no more boundaries built on the fiction that we're strangers performing roles. We'd be choosing to be actually married, in every sense. Are you ready for that?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at the end of her braid. "I've never been with a man that way," she said finally, her voice low. "Never expected to be. The town called me an old maid, but the truth is I chose it. Chose books and teaching over marriage because no man I met seemed worth surrendering my autonomy for. They all wanted to own, to control, to diminish." She looked up at him. "You're different. You see my strength as something valuable rather than threatening. So yes, I'm ready. Terrified, but ready. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Caleb replied quietly. "I'm terrified too. Not of you, but of failing you. Of not being enough after you've already given up so much." "Then we'll be terrified together," Eleanor said with a small smile. "Seems to be working for us so far." The morning progressed with agonizing normalcy. Breakfast, Lucy's chatter about what she hoped to learn at school that day, the usual ranch chores that couldn't be neglected regardless of personal upheaval. Eleanor taught her class with her usual focused intensity, while Caleb worked on reinforcing the chorale sections that still needed attention, his knee protesting but functional enough for light work. When the school day ended and the last student departed, Lucy included, she was spending the afternoon at the Whitmores helping Martha with preserving vegetables. Caleb and Eleanor finally found themselves alone. He met her at the schoolhouse door, and they walked together toward the main house without speaking, the silence charged with everything unspoken. Inside, Eleanor turned to face him in the kitchen where this had all somehow begun, where they'd first negotiated boundaries and expectations. "I believe you had something to ask me," she said, trying for light, but her voice coming out breathless. Caleb stepped closer, near enough to see the pulse beating rapid in her throat, to catch the scent of chalk dust and soap that had become familiar as home. "Eleanor Brooks Hartley," he said quietly. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his hands were cupping her face, and his mouth was on hers, and everything else fell away. It was nothing like the perfunctory brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. This was real and warm and increasingly urgent as Eleanor's hands came up to grip his shoulders as she made a small sound in the back of her throat that shot straight through him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "That was," he started. "Overdue," Eleanor finished, "and insufficient. I want more." She pulled him back down, and this time the kiss deepened, became something that made Caleb's knees weak and his heart pound like he was a boy instead of a man in his 30s. Eleanor kissed like she did everything else, with complete focus and surprising intensity, learning quickly what made him respond and exploiting it shamelessly. When they separated again, Caleb was dizzy and Eleanor's face was flushed, her carefully braided hair coming loose from its pins. "We should probably move this conversation somewhere more private," Eleanor said, her voice husky, "before Lucy comes home or someone decides to visit unexpectedly." "Upstairs?" Caleb asked, and the question contained multitudes. Eleanor nodded, taking his hand and leading him toward the stairs. In the bedroom that had been hers but would now be theirs, she turned to face him with sudden uncertainty, showing through her usual confidence. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "I know the mechanics, obviously. I'm not ignorant. But the reality of it, the vulnerability, that's different than anything I've read about." "We don't have to rush," Caleb said, though his body was screaming otherwise. "We can take this slow, figure it out together." "I don't want slow," Eleanor replied, surprising him. "I've been cautious and careful my entire life, made every decision based on protecting myself from disappointment or harm. Just this once, I want to be reckless, to want something without calculating the cost first." She reached for the buttons of her dress with shaking fingers. "Stay with me? Help me be brave?" Caleb caught her hands, stilling them. "You're the bravest person I know. But let me." He began unfastening the small buttons with careful precision, taking his time despite the urgency singing in his blood. "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world now." What followed was tender and awkward, and occasionally fumbling, two people learning each other's bodies and responses, Eleanor's inexperience balanced by Caleb's patience, both of them discovering that choosing each other freely transformed everything. When it was over, they lay tangled together in the afternoon light, Eleanor's head on Caleb's chest, his hand stroking her loose hair. "That was not what I expected," Eleanor said finally, her voice soft and wondering. "Good different or bad different?" Caleb asked, suddenly anxious. "Good," Eleanor assured him quickly. "Overwhelming, but good. I felt—" She paused, searching for words. "I felt like myself, but more so. Like all the parts of me I've kept separate and protected could finally integrate. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Caleb replied, pulling her closer. "That's what it should feel like. What it should always feel like with the right person." They dozed briefly, exhausted by emotion as much as physical activity. When they woke, the sun was lower, and Lucy would be home soon. They dressed quickly, helping each other with buttons and laces, the intimacy of it somehow as meaningful as what had preceded it. Downstairs, making coffee with Eleanor moving comfortably around the kitchen, Caleb felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. Not the same, because Eleanor was fundamentally different from Sarah in temperament and approach, but equally valuable. Perhaps more so for being chosen freely rather than falling into it through youth and proximity. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. "That I'm grateful," Caleb said simply, "for Pemberton's manipulation, as twisted as that sounds. Because without it, we never would have found each other. I would have lost the ranch and drifted away. You would have remained trapped in poverty and obscurity. Sometimes terrible circumstances lead to the right places." Eleanor came to stand beside him, leaning into his side. "I've been thinking about that too, about choice and fate, and how sometimes we can't see the path until we're already walking it. A month ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm teaching again, helping rebuild a community, married to someone who sees me as an equal. It feels impossible, like something from a story rather than real life." "It's real," Caleb assured her. "We're real. Everything we've built together, that's real." Lucy returned just before supper, bursting with stories about her afternoon. If she noticed anything different about the adults, she didn't comment beyond a knowing smile that suggested 8-year-olds were more perceptive than they were given credit for. Over dinner, they discussed the cooperative's upcoming meeting, planning for winter supplies, the progress Lucy's younger students were making with their letters. It felt like family, felt like home in ways that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. That night, Eleanor moved the last of her belongings into Caleb's room, their room now, officially and actually. It didn't take long. She'd never accumulated much, and what she had was practical rather than decorative. But the act of combining their spaces, of acknowledging that the separation was over, felt monumental. "What do we tell people?" Eleanor asked as they prepared for bed. "About us? About this change?" "The truth," Caleb said, "that we started as strangers forced together by circumstance, but we're choosing to become something more. People can think what they want. We know what's real." The winter came early that year, snow falling in November and staying through March. But the ranch weathered it better than previous years, with Caleb's recovered mobility and Eleanor's organizational skills creating efficiency they'd never had before. The cooperative continued functioning, loans extended and repaid, families supporting each other through the lean months. Eleanor's school thrived, enrollment growing to 12 students as word spread about the quality of education she provided. In January, Eleanor received notification that she'd be needed in Helena in March for Pemberton's trial. The prospect hung over them like a shadow, a reminder that the past wasn't entirely resolved no matter how stable the present felt. The night before Eleanor was scheduled to leave for Helena, Caleb would accompany her, of course, leaving Lucy with the Whitmores. They sat together in their bedroom, Eleanor going through her testimony notes one final time. "I'm not afraid of facing him," she said, though her hands betrayed her with their trembling. "I'm afraid of what it might change. Like testifying will somehow break the spell, and we'll remember this was all built on coercion and manipulation." "Nothing about what we have now is coercion," Caleb replied firmly. "Pemberton forced the marriage, but he doesn't control what we've made of it. He doesn't get that power." "I know," Eleanor said. "Rationally, I know that, but fear isn't always rational." "Then be afraid," Caleb said gently. "Be afraid and testify anyway, like you've done everything else that's scared you since I met you." The journey to Helena took 3 days by stage, the territorial capital a bustling city compared to Silver Ridge's quiet isolation. The courthouse was imposing, all dark wood and formal proceedings that felt designed to intimidate. But when Eleanor took the stand, dressed in her best dress with her hair arranged severely, she spoke with calm clarity that commanded the courtroom's attention. She detailed Pemberton's fraudulent practices, the forged documents, the manipulation of desperate families. When Pemberton's lawyer tried to discredit her by bringing up her firing from the teaching position, suggesting her judgment was questionable, Eleanor responded with devastating precision. "I was fired for teaching girls that their minds had value beyond domestic service, for encouraging them to question authority and think independently. If that makes my judgment questionable in your estimation, then yes, I'm guilty as charged, but it doesn't make my testimony about Mr. Pemberton's criminal activities any less accurate." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order, and Caleb, watching from the gallery, felt pride surge through him so intense it was almost painful. Pemberton himself sat at the defense table, his formerly immaculate appearance now shabby from months in custody, his expression one of impotent fury. When his eyes met Eleanor's, she held his gaze steadily until he looked away first. A small victory, but victory nonetheless. The trial lasted 5 days. Other victims testified, their stories corroborating Eleanor's documentation. The territorial prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. When the verdict came, guilty on all 17 counts, Eleanor sat perfectly still, absorbing the reality that the man who'd controlled her fate was now facing life imprisonment. Outside the courthouse afterward, Caleb pulled her into his arms despite the public setting. "You did it," he said quietly. "You brought him down. You and everyone else he hurt. He can't harm anyone ever again." "It doesn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would," Eleanor admitted. "Mostly, I just feel tired. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that even putting it down is exhausting." "Then let's go home," Caleb said. "Back to the ranch, to Lucy, to everything we've built that has nothing to do with him. Let this be the end of his part in our story." They returned to Silver Ridge to find the cooperative had organized a celebration in Eleanor's honor. Nearly 60 people crowded into the church basement, families whose lives had been touched by Pemberton's crimes and Eleanor's courage in confronting them. There were speeches praising her integrity, gifts of preserves and hand-knitted items, and heartfelt thanks from people who'd never expected justice to be possible. Martha Whitmore raised her glass of cider in toast. "To Eleanor Hartley, who proved that one woman with courage and conviction can change the world. Or at least change Silver Ridge County, which is world enough for most of us." The laughter and applause felt warm and genuine. Lucy stood beside Eleanor, beaming with pride at her stepmother's accomplishments. And Caleb, watching his wife accept recognition she'd never expected and barely knew how to handle, felt his heart expand with something too large to name. Love, certainly, but also respect and admiration, and the deep satisfaction of partnership with someone extraordinary. Spring came late but glorious, the land exploding into green after the hard winter. The ranch prospered under their joint management, cattle multiplying, crops showing promise. Eleanor's school enrollment reached 18 students, forcing them to add another room to the converted shed. The cooperative approved loans for 3 new businesses in town, creating employment and economic growth that benefited everyone. On a warm afternoon in May, nearly 6 months after Pemberton's conviction, Eleanor found Caleb repairing fence posts on the north pasture. She rode out on the horse she'd learned to manage with characteristic determination, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face bright with sun, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "I have news," she announced, dismounting with more grace than she'd possessed months ago. "Good news?" Caleb asked, setting down his hammer. "That depends on your perspective," Eleanor replied, and now he could identify what he saw in her face. Joy mixed with trepidation. "I'm pregnant. About 10 weeks, the doctor thinks." Caleb stood frozen, the information taking a moment to fully register. A baby. Their baby. Proof that what had started as forced obligation had transformed into something generative and real. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully, knowing Eleanor's complicated relationship with traditional female roles. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted, "and exhilarated, and worried about how I'll manage teaching with an infant, and also strangely proud that my body can do this thing I'd written off as impossible, all of it simultaneously." She moved closer. "How do you feel about it?" Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding tight. "Same, all of those things, but mostly grateful. That we get to do this together, that something good is coming from everything we survived." Lucy, when they told her that evening, responded with cautious excitement. "Will it be a brother or sister?" "We won't know for months," Eleanor replied. "How would you feel about either?" Lucy considered this seriously. "Either would be all right, I think, as long as it doesn't cry too much and you don't forget about me." "Never," Eleanor promised fiercely. "You're irreplaceable, Lucy Hartley. This baby doesn't change that." The pregnancy progressed without complications. Eleanor continuing to teach through her 6th month before finally accepting that climbing the schoolhouse steps while heavily pregnant was impractical. She trained Martha's oldest daughter, Emily, to take over temporarily, trusting the girl's sharp mind and Eleanor's own curriculum notes to maintain quality instruction. The baby arrived on a December morning, snow falling softly outside while Eleanor labored with Martha attending and Caleb pacing anxiously downstairs. When the first cry echoed through the house, Caleb nearly knocked over a chair in his haste to reach the bedroom. His son, their son, was small and red-faced and perfect, screaming his displeasure at being forced into the cold world. Eleanor looked exhausted and radiant, her hair sweat-soaked, her face glowing with accomplishment. "James," she said, naming him after her father. "If that's acceptable to you." "It's perfect," Caleb replied, carefully taking the infant. "He's perfect. You're perfect. All of it's perfect." Lucy, allowed in to meet her brother, touched his tiny hand with wondering gentleness. "He's so small. Was I this small?" "Smaller," Caleb said, and just as loud. "I'll teach him things," Lucy declared. "When he's bigger. I'll teach him to read and do sums and all the things Eleanor taught me." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor said tiredly. "He'll need a good teacher." The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and infant care, ranch work that couldn't be neglected, and the slow adjustment to being a family of 4. James was a demanding baby, colicky and difficult, but he bound them together in new ways. Shared exhaustion creating intimacy, midnight feeding sessions becoming time for quiet conversation, the fierce protectiveness both parents felt over their child intensifying their commitment to each other. By spring, Eleanor was back to teaching part-time, James sleeping in a cradle in the schoolhouse corner while older students took turns rocking him when he fussed. The arrangement was unconventional, but functional, and the community had learned that Eleanor's unconventional approaches usually worked better than traditional methods. One evening in late spring, nearly 2 years after their forced marriage, Caleb and Eleanor sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky while James nursed and Lucy practiced her letters inside. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and stable, the cooperative's success visible in new buildings appearing in Silver Ridge, and families no longer crushed by predatory debt. "Do you remember what you asked me?" Eleanor said quietly, "about whether I'd undo this marriage if I could go back?" "I remember," Caleb replied. "I've been thinking about it again, about choice and circumstance, and how we define freedom." She adjusted James against her shoulder, patting his back to coax up a burp. "I thought freedom meant being unmarried, unencumbered, able to do whatever I wanted without asking permission." "But that wasn't freedom. That was just being alone. This is freedom. Choosing who I want to build with, choosing to teach and to mother and to be a wife, all simultaneously, choosing complexity over simplicity because complexity with the right person is richer than simplicity alone." "You're saying the forced marriage made you more free than being single did?" Caleb asked, slightly amused. "I'm saying that sometimes constraints force us to discover capacities we didn't know we had," Eleanor replied. "And sometimes the wrong beginning leads to the right ending if we're brave enough to keep building despite the foundation we're given." She looked at him directly. "We were coerced into marriage. But everything that came after, that was choice. Every day we chose each other. Every challenge we faced together instead of apart. That's what made us free." Caleb reached over to take her free hand. "I was thinking earlier about what I'd tell myself 2 years ago if I could. That man standing in Pemberton's office, feeling like his life was ending. What would I say to him?" "What would you say?" Eleanor asked. "That sometimes the worst things lead to the best things," Caleb replied. "That the woman he's about to marry against his will is going to save him in ways he can't imagine. That his daughter will learn what strength looks like from someone who embodies it. That he'll discover partnership doesn't require romance to start with. Sometimes it builds romance as foundation instead of decoration." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'd tell him to trust the process even when it feels impossible. That the forced vow becomes a chosen one, and the chosen one becomes sacred." Eleanor's eyes were bright with tears. "I'd tell the woman I was then that being scorned and dismissed and fired was actually the beginning of finding herself. That marrying a stranger would teach her more about trust than any friend ever could. That teaching 7 students in a converted shed would feel more meaningful than teaching 50 in a proper school, because those 7 were there by choice instead of assignment. She smiled through the tears. I'd tell her that old maids become new wives, and new wives become mothers and teachers and community leaders, and all of it is possible if you're brave enough to keep showing up. Inside the house, Lucy called out that she'd finished her letters and could she please come outside now. They invited her to join them, the girl squeezing between her parents on the porch bench, all of them watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Tell me the story again, Lucy requested, as she had increasingly over the past months. About how you and Papa got married. Eleanor and Caleb exchanged glances, silently negotiating how to tell the truth without traumatizing a child. Once upon a time, Eleanor began, there was a rancher who was in trouble and a teacher who was struggling. A cruel man thought he could use their desperation to control them both, so he forced them to marry each other. That's the bad part, Lucy said knowingly. But then comes the good part. Then comes the good part, Caleb agreed, because the rancher and the teacher discovered they were both stronger than they knew. They stood up to the cruel man together. They built a home and a school and helped their community become better. And slowly, without planning to, they fell in love with each other. Not the fairy tale kind of love, Eleanor continued, the real kind. The kind built on respect and partnership and choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. And they had a baby, Lucy added, reaching over to touch James's tiny hand. And they had a baby, Eleanor confirmed. And they lived not happily ever after, because life isn't that simple, but contentedly and purposefully, and together, which is better than happily anyway. I like our story, Lucy declared, even the bad parts, because without the bad parts, we wouldn't have the good parts. That's wisdom beyond your years, Eleanor said softly, pulling the girl closer. They sat together as night deepened, this family forged from desperation and transformed by choice, watching stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. The ranch house behind them glowed with lamplight. The converted schoolhouse stood ready for tomorrow's lessons. The cooperative offices in town held ledgers documenting a new way of living and doing business. All of it built by people who'd been broken and decided to rebuild together. Pemberton had meant to destroy them both. Instead, he'd inadvertently created something far more powerful than he'd ever imagined, a partnership that had reshaped an entire community's future. A marriage that proved coercion could be transformed into love through daily choice and mutual respect. A family that demonstrated strength came in many forms. Years later, when James was old enough to understand, they'd tell him the full story of his parents' beginning, the good and the terrible and everything between. They'd tell him that sometimes the right paths start from the wrong places, that character is revealed in crisis, and that the ability to choose who you become matters more than the circumstances that shaped you. But tonight, sitting on the porch with stars overhead and family close, the story didn't need explanation or justification. It simply was. Imperfect and beautiful, forced and chosen, the worst beginning transformed into the best continuation through courage and commitment and the daily decision to keep building something worth keeping. The forced vow had become a love story after all. Not the kind that started with romance, but the kind that lasted, built on rock instead of sand, forged in fire instead of dreamed in comfort, chosen freely after being imposed unwillingly. Eleanor leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder, James sleeping against her chest, Lucy warm and solid between them. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Caleb asked. "For seeing me," Eleanor replied simply. "For choosing to see me as more than the burden you were forced to accept. For building this with me instead of just enduring it." "Same to you," Caleb said quietly. "You saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me back hope when I thought I'd lost it permanently. You showed Lucy what strength looks like. You gave me a son and a partnership and a reason to believe good things were still possible." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "That's what partners do." They stayed there until cold forced them inside, until Lucy was yawning and James needed changing and the 1,000 small demands of life reasserted themselves. But the moment remained, crystallized in memory, proof that the worst circumstances could transform into the best outcomes if people were brave enough to keep choosing each other, day after difficult day, building something lasting from the broken pieces they'd been given. The forced vow had brought them together. But love, real and chosen and earned through shared struggle, had made them family. And that made all the difference. In Silver Ridge County, people would talk for years about Eleanor Hartley, the woman who'd brought down a corrupt banker, founded a cooperative that changed how the community functioned, taught a generation of children to think critically and question authority. They'd talk about the schools she built from nothing, the lives she'd touched, the systems she'd helped dismantle and rebuild more fairly. But in the Hartley household, she was simply Eleanor, wife and mother and partner, imperfect and human and deeply loved. Not for what she accomplished, though that mattered, but for who she was. For her strength and intelligence and the fierce determination that had carried them all through impossible situations. And Caleb was simply the man who'd been lucky enough to see her value when the rest of the world had dismissed her, who'd chosen to build with her instead of against her, who'd learned that partnership came in many forms, and sometimes the best kind grew from the worst beginnings. Their story wasn't neat or simple or traditionally romantic, but it was theirs, honest and hard-won and precious, precisely because it had been earned instead of given. The forced vow had ended. The chosen life had begun. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.